Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story and finding it as fascinating as we do, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're watching the sunrise in Tokyo or settling in for the night in London. It's not required, but we genuinely enjoy connecting with our global community. Now, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a massive thank you to KD Lofty for suggesting this topic. This is one we've been wanting to cover for a long time, and your suggestion was the perfect push we needed. Imagine holding a secret so profound that releasing it could rewrite human history. Imagine being told to stay silent, not by choice, but by order. Now imagine that secret involves the most watched moment in television history, the Apollo 11 moon landing, and what 3 astronauts allegedly saw on the lunar surface that was never meant to reach the public. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most explosive conspiracy theories ever to emerge from the space race, a missing transmission, a hidden film reel, and the terrifying possibility that humanity's first steps on the moon were also our first encounter with something we were never supposed to find. Apollo 11. The transmission they never released. Part 1. The engineer's confession. The fluorescent lights in the Euston diner flickered as journalist Marcus Webb sat across from a man who looked like he'd been carrying the weight of the world for 50 years. Ernest Hale was 83 years old, his hands trembling slightly as they wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The wrinkles on his face seemed to deepen in the harsh light, and his eyes, once sharp and calculating during his years as a NASA communications engineer, now held something different. Fear, regret, and an urgent need to unburden himself before time ran out. 2 minutes and 42 seconds, Hale said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's how much they cut. Marcus had received the cryptic email 3 weeks earlier. No details, just a time and a place, and a single line that had made his investigative instincts flare to life, like a signal fire in the darkness. I know what Armstrong really saw on the moon. As a journalist specialising in declassified government documents and Cold War-era conspiracies, Marcus had heard plenty of wild claims about Apollo 11. Most were easily debunked fantasies, the kind of stories that fell apart the moment you applied even basic scrutiny. But something about Hale's message felt different. The man had credentials, a verifiable 40-year career at NASA, working specifically in communications during the Apollo program. This wasn't some basement-dwelling theorist. This was someone who had been in the room. You're telling me NASA deliberately cut audio from the moon landing broadcast? Marcus asked, activating the voice recorder on his phone and sliding it across the table. Hale nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window where the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red. Not just audio. There was a complete transmission blackout for exactly 2 minutes and 42 seconds, right after Armstrong set foot on the surface. The public version shows a brief interruption, static, technical difficulties. That's the official story. But I was in the communications room that night. I heard everything. And what did you hear? The old man's hands tightened around his cup. Armstrong's voice, different than before, shaken. He said, and I quote, "They're here. They're watching us." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm Texas evening. They? That's what he said. Houston immediately switched him to the medical channel, the encrypted line. Protocol was that channel was only for health emergencies, astronaut vital signs, things like that. But they used it for something else that day. They used it to have a conversation the world was never meant to hear. Marcus leaned forward, his journalistic skepticism warring with the undeniable conviction in Hale's voice. Why are you telling me this now? Why wait 50 years? Hale's laugh was bitter and hollow. Because I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 4 months, maybe 6 if I'm lucky. I've kept this secret for half a century because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my pension, afraid of being labelled a lunatic, afraid of what they might do to keep me quiet, but I'm out of time, and I can't take this to my grave. Someone needs to know the truth." The engineer reached into a worn leather satchel beside him and pulled out a manila folder, its edges frayed from age. Inside were photocopied pages, technical diagrams, and what appeared to be mission transcripts with entire sections blacked out. "This is everything I managed to save before they sanitized the records," Hale said, sliding the folder across the table. "Start with July 20th, 1969. Start with the real history, then I'll show you where the lies begin." Part 2. The Descent. Marcus spent the next 3 days immersed in the documented facts of Apollo 11, separating verifiable history from speculation. The mission had launched on July 16th, 1969, from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 3 men, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, embarked on humanity's most ambitious journey. Their destination was the Sea of Tranquility, a vast lunar plain chosen for its relatively flat terrain. The early stages of the mission proceeded flawlessly. The Saturn V rocket performed exactly as designed, pushing the command module and lunar module out of Earth's orbit and onto a trajectory toward the Moon. For 3 days, the crew travelled through the void of space, performing course corrections and systems checks, their every movement monitored by ground control in Houston. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module, nicknamed Eagle, and began their descent to the surface while Collins remained in the command module, Columbia, orbiting above. This was where the first anomaly occurred, one that was documented in the official records but never fully explained. As Eagle descended toward the lunar surface, computer alarms began screaming in the cramped cockpit. Error code 1201, then 1202. Program alarms that indicated the guidance computer was being overwhelmed with data, receiving more information than it could process. In the official NASA narrative, these alarms were caused by a radar system inadvertently left on, flooding the computer with unnecessary data. Flight controllers in Houston made a split-second decision to proceed with the landing despite the alarms, trusting that the computer could handle the essential functions even while overloaded. But in Hale's documents, in the margins of a photocopied mission transcript, someone had written in pencil, "Alarms triggered by external scan. Eagle detected and scanned by." The question mark hung there, ominous and unfinished. Armstrong took manual control of Eagle, guiding it away from a boulder-strewn crater toward a smoother landing site. At this point, fuel was running critically low. The mission clock showed they had less than 30 seconds of landing fuel remaining when Armstrong's voice crackled through the speakers in Houston. "Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." The date was July 20th, 1969. The time was 8:17 post-meridium Universal Time. Humanity had reached the Moon, but according to Hale, something was already waiting there. Part 3. The First Steps and the Missing Minutes. 6.5 hours after landing, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch of the lunar module and began his careful descent down the ladder. The world watched grainy black and white images transmitted from a camera mounted on Eagle's exterior. An estimated 600 million people across the globe had their eyes fixed on television screens, witnessing something that had existed only in science fiction just a decade before. At 10:56 post-meridium Eastern Time, Armstrong's boot touched the lunar surface. His words became instant history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The broadcast continued for several minutes, showing Armstrong's initial movements on the surface, his commentary about the fine, powdery consistency of the lunar soil, and his growing confidence in the low-gravity environment. Then, at approximately 11:02 post-meridium Eastern Time, the broadcast experienced what NASA described as a technical interruption. Static filled television screens around the world. Walter Cronkite, anchoring CBS's coverage, assured viewers that engineers were working to restore the signal. The interruption lasted 2 minutes and 42 seconds, just as Hale had said. When the feed returned, Armstrong was further from the lunar module, collecting samples, and everything appeared normal. The mission proceeded. Aldrin joined him on the surface. They planted the American flag, collected rocks, set up scientific instruments, and spoke with President Nixon via a radio hookup. Then they returned to Eagle, launched back to orbit, docked with Columbia, and began the journey home. The official explanation for the broadcast interruption was a temporary failure in the signal relay from the Australian tracking station at Honeysuckle Creek. Equipment malfunction. Nothing unusual. The missing minutes were simply dead air, static, an unfortunate technical glitch in an otherwise flawless broadcast. But Hale's documents told a different story. In the folder he'd given Marcus was a page that appeared to be from an internal NASA communications log. Most of it was standard technical jargon, signal strength readings, tracking data, confirmation of uplink and downlink status. But there was one entry, time-stamped at 11:01 post-meridian Eastern Time, that made Marcus's heart race. Switch to med channel on CDR request. Override standard protocol. Restricted transcript to follow. Public feed hold for 2.7 minutes. CDR commander. Neil Armstrong had requested the channel switch himself. And there was something else in the folder. A fragmentary transcript labelled Apollo 11 EVA Medical Channel Excerpt, July 20, 1969, 11:01 to 11:03 p.m. Eastern. Most of it was redacted, thick black lines covering entire paragraphs, but a few lines remained visible. Armstrong. Houston, we have... There are other craft here. Repeat, other craft. Houston. Say again, Eagle. Armstrong. They're on the ridge. 3 of them. Lined up. They're watching us. Houston. Stand by, Eagle. Switching to... The rest was blacked out. Marcus read the fragment a dozen times, his mind racing. If this was authentic, if Armstrong had really reported seeing craft on the moon, then the implications were staggering. But he needed more than a photocopied document from a dying man. He needed corroboration. That's when Hale mentioned the second camera feed. Part 4. The hidden feed. According to Hale, there were 2 video channels transmitting from the Apollo 11 mission. The public feed, broadcast worldwide, originated from the camera mounted on Eagle's descent stage. But there was a second feed, encrypted and transmitted on a classified frequency, that went directly to a secure facility in Houston, with simultaneous feeds to Langley Air Force Base and the Pentagon. The second camera was inside Armstrong's helmet, Hale explained during their second meeting, this time at his modest ranch house on the outskirts of Houston. Part of the biomedical monitoring system officially. It was supposed to record the astronauts' field of view for training and debriefing purposes. But the real reason was reconnaissance. The Air Force wanted independent visual confirmation of everything the astronauts encountered. And you saw this second feed? Marcus asked. Hale nodded. I was part of the team monitoring communications integrity. I had access to all the channels, including the restricted ones. When Armstrong made his first report about the craft, they switched the helmet camera feed to the main screen in the control room. That's when I saw them. Them. Structures. On a ridge about half a mile from the landing site, cylindrical, metallic. They weren't natural formations. The shadows they cast were geometric, precise, and while we watched, one of them moved. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Moved how? It rotated, slowly, like it was tracking Armstrong's position. Then the feed cut out. Someone at a higher pay grade than me pulled the plug. When it came back online 30 seconds later, the camera was pointed at the ground. We never saw those structures again. And no one said anything? No one questioned it? Hale's expression hardened. 3 people in that room saw what I saw. 2 of them are dead now. The 3rd won't return my calls. We were told immediately after the mission that what we'd witnessed was classified under national security protocols. We signed additional non-disclosure agreements. We were reminded that violating those agreements would be considered treason. Marcus tried to process this. But why? If there were structures on the moon, artificial structures, why hide it? That would be the most significant discovery in human history. Think about it, Hale said quietly. July 1969. We're still in the Cold War. We've just beaten the Soviets to the moon by a matter of months. Now imagine announcing to the world that we found evidence of non-human intelligence up there. What happens? Panic? Maybe. But more importantly, what happens to the space race? Do the Americans and Soviets suddenly start cooperating? Do other nations demand access to lunar exploration? Do we lose our strategic advantage? So you're saying they covered it up for geopolitical reasons. I'm saying they covered it up because they didn't know what they were dealing with. Were these structures abandoned? Active? Were they watching us? Could they be hostile? The people making decisions decided it was safer to study this quietly, secretly, rather than denounce it to a world that wasn't ready. Marcus leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. I need to verify this. I need to talk to other people who were there. Hale smiled sadly. Good luck. Most of them are dead or won't talk. But there's one person you might try. Rosa Klein. She worked in the NASA archives for 30 years. She might remember some things. Part 5. The Archivist's Evidence. Rosa Klein lived in a small apartment in Pasadena, California, surrounded by stacks of books, photographs, and memories of a lifetime spent preserving humanity's reach into space. She was 76 years old, sharp as a tack, and deeply suspicious when Marcus first contacted her. Ernest Hale sent you? She asked over the phone, her voice guarded. I haven't spoken to Ernest in 20 years. Why would he send someone to me now? Because he's dying, Marcus said simply, and he wants the truth to come out before he goes. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Klein sighed. Come to Pasadena, we'll talk, but I'm not promising anything. 3 days later, Marcus sat in Klein's cramped living room, drinking tea from delicate china cups that seemed wildly out of place given the conversation they were about to have. I worked in the NASA archives from 1972 to 2002, Klein began, her eyes distant with memory. My job was to catalogue, preserve, and maintain access to mission documentation, photographs, film, audio recordings, everything. Apollo 11 was before my time, but the documentation from that mission was extensive. Thousands of photographs, hours of film, telemetry data, mission reports. And you found something unusual? Marcus prompted. Klein set down her teacup carefully. In 1987, I was conducting a routine inventory of Apollo 11 photographic materials. We had recently digitized a batch of images, and I was cross-referencing the digital copies against the physical archives. That's when I noticed discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies? Missing images. The photo manifest, the official list of every photograph taken during the mission, listed several images that weren't in the archive. The designations were sequential, standard NASA format, as 11-something-something. But when I tried to locate the physical photographs, they were gone. And here's the strange part. The gaps in the sequence all fell within a specific time frame. Let me guess, Marcus said. Right after the landing? Klein nodded. The missing images were all from the first 40 minutes Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface. I filed a report about the discrepancy. 2 weeks later, my supervisor called me into his office and told me I'd made a mistake. The missing photos had never existed. The manifest I'd seen was an early draft that included planned photos that were never actually taken due to time constraints. But you didn't believe that? Of course not. I'd been doing that job for 15 years. I knew the difference between a preliminary photo plan and a completed mission manifest. But I also knew when to keep my mouth shut. I let go. Officially. And unofficially? Klein stood and walked to a bookshelf crammed with binders and folders. She pulled out a slim blue folder and handed it to Marcus. Inside was a photocopy of a document, yellowed with age but still legible. It was a photo manifest stamped with official NASA headers and dated August 5th, 1969. Marcus scanned the list of image designations, his pulse quickening as he saw the gaps Klein had mentioned. AS-11-43 through AS-11-51 were missing. 8 consecutive images. I made a copy before they sanitized the records, Klein said quietly. I knew someday someone would ask questions. I just didn't think it would take this long. What do you think those photos showed? Klein sat back down, her hands folded in her lap. I think they showed whatever Armstrong and Aldrin saw on that ridge. I think someone at NASA or the Pentagon decided those images were too sensitive to remain in the public archive, so they removed them and pretended they never existed. Marcus felt the pieces starting to come together, but he still needed more. Did you ever hear anything else? Rumours? Gossip? Anything about what might have been on those photos? Klein hesitated, then nodded slowly. There was an old technician, worked in photo processing during the Apollo era. He retired in the late 80s. We used to have lunch sometimes, talk shop. One day, after a few drinks, he told me about a special project he'd worked on. He called it the clean-up detail. Clean-up? His job was to retouch lunar surface photos before they were released to the public. NASA claimed it was just to enhance clarity, improve contrast, make the images more suitable for publication, but he said they were removing things. Shadows that didn't match the terrain, reflections that couldn't be explained, dark silhouettes on distant horizons. Marcus's mind was racing. Did he say specifically what they were removing? He wouldn't give details, but he did say one thing I've never forgotten. He said the moon wasn't empty when we got there. He said it was never empty. Part 6. The Astronaut's Silence. Michael Collins, the third member of the Apollo 11 crew, orbited the moon alone in the command module Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin made history on the surface below. Every public account emphasized his isolation. The loneliest man in the universe, they called him, cut off from all human contact during his passes around the moon's far side. But according to Hale's documents, Collins made his own disturbing observations during those solitary orbits. Marcus tracked down a former NASA public affairs officer who'd worked with Collins during post-mission appearances. The man, who insisted on anonymity, agreed to meet at a bar in Clear Lake, Texas, not far from the Johnson Space Center. Collins was different after Apollo 11, the former officer said, nursing a beer and keeping his voice low despite the noise of the sports bar around them. Armstrong and Aldrin got all the attention, obviously, but Collins was the one who seemed most affected by the experience. He did the appearances, the tours, the press conferences, but there was something in his eyes, like he'd seen something that changed him. Did he ever talk about it? Marcus asked. Not publicly, but there were private moments. I travelled with him for 2 years after the mission, helping coordinate media appearances. One night we're in a hotel in Tokyo, both of us jet-lagged, sitting in the bar at 3 a.m. He's had a few drinks, more than usual, and he starts talking about the far side of the moon. Marcus leaned closer. What did he say? He said being on the far side was strange. Total radio silence from Earth, from Houston, from the lunar module. Just him and the cosmos. He said that's when he saw it. Saw what? The former officer took a long drink before answering. A light, moving alongside Columbia. At first he thought it was debris, part of the spacecraft, or maybe something from the lunar module, but it paced him. Matched his orbital velocity perfectly. Stayed at a constant distance. He watched it for 3 complete orbits. Then, right as he was about to come back around to the near side, it accelerated and disappeared. Did he report it? He said he did, on the private channel once he re-established contact with Houston. They told him it was probably space junk or an optical illusion from the sun reflecting off particles. But Collins didn't buy it. He said he knew what space debris looked like, and this wasn't it. This was deliberate. This was something watching him. Marcus felt his excitement building. Is there any record of this report? The former officer shook his head. If there is, it's buried deep. Collins never mentioned it publicly. But here's the thing. I wasn't the only one he told. There were others over the years, people he trusted. We all signed NDAs, promised never to discuss conversations we had with the astronauts. But I figure after 50-some years, and with you already digging into this, maybe it's time. Back in his hotel room that night, Marcus reviewed everything he'd gathered so far. Hale's testimony about the transmission blackout and the helmet camera feed, Klein's evidence of missing photographs and image manipulation, now Collins's unreported sighting in lunar orbit. The pattern was becoming clear. Multiple independent sources all pointing to the same conclusion. Something happened during Apollo 11 that was deliberately concealed from the public. But he still needed the smoking gun. He needed direct testimony from one of the astronauts themselves. That's when he remembered Hale mentioning Buzz Aldrin. Part 7. The Aldrin Interview. Buzz Aldrin was the second human to walk on the moon, and over the decades since Apollo 11, he'd become known for his candour, his willingness to speak about his experiences and struggles. He'd discussed his battles with depression and alcoholism, his frustrations with NASA, bureaucracy, his thoughts on the future of space exploration. And on a few notable occasions he'd hinted at something unusual during the Apollo 11 mission. Marcus found a reference to a 1996 interview that Aldrin had done with a small aerospace magazine. The interview had never been published, supposedly due to editorial disagreements, but the journalist who conducted it, a woman named Patricia Hammond, was still alive and working as a freelance writer in Florida. When Marcus called her, Hammond's response was immediate and defensive. "I don't talk about that interview. I signed an agreement." "With NASA?" Marcus asked. "With lawyers representing NASA. They made it very clear that certain portions of my conversation with Aldrin were not suitable for publication. They compensated me for my time and my silence." "But you still have the recording?" A long pause. Then quietly, "Maybe." It took 3 more phone calls, a promise to keep her name out of any publication, and a wire transfer of $5,000 before Hammond agreed to send Marcus a digital copy of the suppressed portion of the interview. What he heard made his hands shake. The interview audio was scratchy, clearly recorded on older equipment, but the voices were clear. Hammond asking questions, Aldrin answering thoughtfully, until she asked about the famous UFO sighting during Apollo 11. In public statements over the years, Aldrin had acknowledged seeing something unusual during the flight to the moon, but always with caveats. It was probably a panel from the spacecraft separation. It could have been debris, nothing definitive, but in this unpublished interview his tone was different. "Hammond, there's been a lot of speculation about what you saw on the way to the moon. Can you describe it?" Aldrin, "We saw something, all 3 of us. It was following us, maintaining distance. It wasn't debris, because debris doesn't maintain formation. It wasn't the Saturn IV panel, because we could see that tumbling away in a different direction." Hammond, "What did it look like?" Aldrin, "Cylindrical, metallic. When the sun hit it at certain angles, it was brilliant. Other times it was dark, almost invisible. We reported it to Houston on a private channel." Hammond, "And what did Houston say?" Aldrin, "They told us not to discuss it publicly. They said it would cause unnecessary panic. But that wasn't the strangest part." Hammond, "What was the strangest part?" Aldrin, long pause. "When we landed on the moon, there were 3 more of them, on the ridge, just like the one that followed us. Same shape, same size, like they were waiting." Hammond, "You reported this as well?" Aldrin, "Of course. Neil did, immediately. That's when they cut the public feed and put us on the encrypted channel. They didn't want the world to hear what we were describing." Hammond, "What did you describe?" Aldrin, "Structures, technology, something that definitely wasn't human. We were told very clearly that this information was classified under national security protocols. We were told that discussing it could jeopardize not just the space program, but national security itself." Hammond, "And you've kept quiet all these years?" Aldrin, "What choice did I have? You think I wanted to be labelled a crackpot? You think I wanted to spend the rest of my life being questioned about little green men? But I'll tell you this, what we saw was real. It was there. And someone needs to find out what it was and why we were told to stay silent." The recording ended there. According to Hammond, that's when Aldrin's publicist had intervened, ended the interview, and initiated the legal process to suppress the recording. Marcus listened to it 5 more times, making detailed notes. This was it. Direct testimony from one of the Apollo 11 astronauts, on record, describing exactly what Hale had claimed: the structures on the ridge, the encrypted communication channel, the directive to remain silent, but he still needed to know what happened next. What did NASA do with this information? Where did it go? The answer, according to Hale, lay in a classified debriefing that took place 8 days after the astronauts returned to Earth. Part 8. The the secret debriefing. On July 28, 1969, the Apollo 11 crew underwent their official mission debrief at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. The public version of this debrief covered technical aspects of the flight, equipment performance, scientific observations, and recommendations for future missions. The transcript runs to hundreds of pages and has been publicly available for decades. But according to documents Hale provided, there was a second classified debriefing that same day. This one took place in a secure conference room with only select personnel present. No press, no public record. And according to a fragmentary transcript Hale had managed to preserve, the discussion was explosive. The partial transcript Marcus received was heavily redacted, but enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. Classified debriefing, Apollo 11. Crew date, July 28, 1969. Location, Building 30, Manned Spacecraft Center. Present, redacted, redacted. N. Armstrong, E. Aldrin, M. Collins, redacted. Redacted. Gentlemen, this session is classified top secret. Nothing discussed here leaves this room. Is that understood? Armstrong. Understood. Redacted. Commander Armstrong, please describe in detail what you observed at 11:01 Eastern Time on July 20th. Armstrong. After exiting the LM and conducting initial surface assessment, I observed 3 cylindrical objects on a ridge approximately 0.8 kilometers from our position. The objects were metallic in appearance, vertical orientation, approximately redacted. Size estimate, Armstrong. Difficult to gauge at that distance, but estimated between 40 and 60 feet in height. They were arranged in a linear pattern, evenly spaced, redacted. Movement, Armstrong. The centre object appeared to rotate slowly. The rotation was observable due to a reflective surface that caught sunlight intermittently. I observed this for approximately 90 seconds before Houston requested channel switch, redacted. Colonel Aldrin, did you observe these objects as well? Aldrin, yes. When I exited the LM approximately 20 minutes later, I looked toward the ridge Armstrong had described. The objects were still visible. I observed what appeared to be independent illumination, a glow that wasn't consistent with solar reflection. Collins, I'd like to add something. Redacted. Go ahead. Collins. During my solo orbits, I observed a similar object maintaining position relative to Columbia. This was consistent across multiple orbits. The object matched our velocity and altitude precisely. When I reported this, I was instructed to... The transcript cuts off here. The remainder of the document was missing, but Hale had provided context in his notes. According to him, the debriefing had concluded with explicit instructions to the crew. They were to maintain absolute silence about their observations. They were told that investigation into the phenomena was ongoing at the highest levels of government, and that premature disclosure could compromise both national security and the space program itself. The astronauts had complied. For 50 years they'd carried the secret. But the government's investigation, according to Hale, had continued in the shadows. Part 9. The Pentagon Connection. The Defense Intelligence Agency had maintained close oversight of the Apollo program from its inception. While NASA was a civilian agency, the military implications of space exploration were obvious. Reconnaissance, communications, potential weapons platforms, all of these fell within DoD's purview. So when Apollo 11 reported anomalous objects on the lunar surface, it was the DIA that took the lead in analysing the implications. Marcus managed to track down a former DIA analyst who'd worked on aerospace intelligence during the late 1960s. The man, who insisted on using only the pseudonym Thomas, agreed to speak on condition of complete anonymity. The Apollo 11 findings triggered a complete reassessment of our understanding of the lunar environment, Thomas said during their secure video call. We'd been sending probes to the moon since the early 60s, Ranger, Surveyor, Lunar Orbiter. None of them had detected anything unusual. No structures, no anomalies. So when the Apollo crew reported what they saw, the initial reaction was skepticism. But they investigated, Marcus asked. Extensively. We pulled every photograph, every piece of telemetry data, every communication transcript. We analysed sun angles, shadow patterns, optical illusions. We even considered the possibility that the crew was hallucinating, some kind of psychological break from the stress of the mission. But you couldn't explain it away. Thomas was silent for a long moment. No, the evidence was too consistent. 3 trained observers, all reporting the same phenomena independently. Visual confirmation from multiple angles. And then there were the photographs. The missing photographs from the archive, Marcus prompted. Those photos weren't missing. They were moved, classified. I saw some of them during the initial analysis. They showed exactly what the crew described. Cylindrical structures, geometric precision, surface composition inconsistent with natural lunar formations. So what did you conclude? Officially, the analysis was inconclusive. We couldn't definitively prove the objects were artificial, so we couldn't justify public disclosure. Unofficially, every analyst who saw that data knew we were looking at something that didn't belong there, something that predated our arrival. Alien technology, Thomas laughed bitterly. That's the obvious conclusion, isn't it? But here's the thing that bothered us most. The objects weren't ancient. They weren't covered in lunar dust. They weren't degraded by micrometeorite impacts or radiation. They looked new, which meant either they were recently placed there, or they were maintained somehow. That's terrifying. It gets worse. We analysed the trajectory of the object Collins reported shadowing the command module. Based on its behaviour, matching orbital velocity, maintaining precise distance, it would have required sophisticated propulsion and guidance systems, more sophisticated than anything we had at the time, maybe more sophisticated than anything we have now. Marcus felt a chill run through him. So what happened? Where did the investigation go from there? Above my pay grade, Thomas said. The analysis was kicked up to a special projects division. I heard rumours it was folded into a broader programme studying unexplained aerial phenomena, what we called UAPs, but the specifics were compartmentalised, need to know only, and I didn't need to know. Do you think we went back, secretly? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We had 6 more Apollo missions after 11. 5 of them successfully landed on the moon. If I were running the program, I would have absolutely sent crews to investigate those structures, get closer, get better images, maybe even attempt contact. But whether that actually happened, I have no idea. The conversation left Marcus with more questions than answers, but it confirmed a crucial point. The Pentagon had taken the Apollo 11 observations seriously enough to launch a classified investigation, which meant the government believed something real had been detected on the moon. Now he needed to know what they found. Part 10. The Photo Laboratory. Following a lead from Rosa Klein, Marcus travelled to the former, site of Building 8 at the Manned Spacecraft Center, now the Johnson Space Center. The building no longer existed, demolished in the early 2000s during a facilities modernization project. But Klein had given him a name, Victor Reeves, a former photo technician who'd worked in Building 8 during the Apollo era. Reeves was 79 years old and living in a retirement community in Arizona. When Marcus called, the old man's voice was surprisingly strong and clear. "Building 8, Reeves said with a dry chuckle. "Haven't thought about that place in years. What's your interest?" Marcus explained his investigation, mentioning Hale's claims about photo manipulation and Klein's discovery of missing images. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then, "I wondered when someone would finally start asking the right questions. Yeah, I worked the photo lab in Building 8 from 67 to 73. And yeah, we did cleanup work on Apollo images. Lots of it. Can you describe what that involved?" Officially, we were enhancing image quality, adjusting contrast, sharpening details, removing artifacts from the development process. And we did do that work. But there was another project. Smaller team, higher security clearance. We called it the Anomaly Review, which involved taking lunar surface photographs and removing anything that didn't fit the expected profile. And before you ask, yes, that included things that appeared artificial, geometric shapes, reflective surfaces where there shouldn't be reflections, shadows that didn't match the sun angle. We'd airbrush them out, retouch the surrounding terrain to make it look natural. How many photos are we talking about? from Apollo 11 specifically, maybe 20, 25 images, but it continued through the other missions. By the end of the Apollo program, we'd cleaned up hundreds of photos. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Did you keep any of the originals? Before the retouching? Reeves laughed. Are you kidding? Everything was tracked. Every original, every work print, every final version. They ran inventory checks weekly. Taking anything out of that lab would have been instant dismissal and probably criminal charges. So there's no way to see what was removed? I didn't say that. Reeves paused. Look, I was young, curious, and I had access to a camera. I may have photographed a few work prints before we retouched them. Just for my own records, you understand. Nothing official. Marcus could barely breathe. You still have those photographs? Maybe. They're old, faded. Been sitting in a box in my garage for 50 years. But if you want to come out to Arizona, I suppose I could dig them out. 2 days later, Marcus was sitting in Reeves's small garage, looking at faded Polaroid images that showed the lunar surface before NASA's cleanup crew got to work. The images were exactly as Reeves had described. Angular shadows that didn't match the terrain, bright. Reflections from areas that should have been in darkness. And in 3 photos, clear geometric shapes on distant ridges. One image in particular made Marcus's hand shake. It showed the horizon beyond the Apollo 11 landing site, and there, unmistakably, were 3 vertical structures arranged in a line. The resolution wasn't good enough to show fine details, but the basic shapes were clear. Cylindrical, metallic, utterly inconsistent with natural geology. That's what you were looking for, isn't it? Reeves said quietly. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Keep it, Reeves said. I'm too old to care about NDAs anymore. If someone wants to prosecute an 80-year-old man for showing you a 50-year-old photo, let them try. The world deserves to know the truth. Part 11. Armstrong's Warning. The deeper Marcus dug into the Apollo 11 cover-up, the more he understood why the astronauts had remained silent for so long. The pressure applied to them hadn't just been bureaucratic or legal. It had been personal and intense. He found evidence of this in an unexpected place. The private papers of a former NASA administrator that had been donated to a university archive. Buried in routine correspondence from the 1970s was a memo from a DA liaison to NASA leadership, marked Eyes Only. The memo, dated April 3, 1970, outlined recommended protocols for managing astronaut testimony regarding classified mission observations. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was clear. Astronauts who discussed their observations publicly would face administrative consequences, including loss of flight status, pension review, and potential criminal prosecution under espionage laws. But there was one instance where the pressure had almost broken. Marcus discovered this through an interview with the widow of a former NASA public affairs officer. Her husband had died in 2008, but she remembered a story he'd told her about Neil Armstrong at a White House event in 1985. My husband said Armstrong had been drinking more than usual that night, she recalled. There was a small reception after the main event, just a few dozen people. Armstrong was talking with some aerospace contractors, and my husband overheard him say something strange. He said, "We were warned away. They didn't want us there." "Warned by who?" Marcus asked. That's what my husband asked, but Armstrong just shook his head and walked away. The next day, my husband got a call from Armstrong's assistant, asking if he'd overheard anything unusual at the reception. When my husband asked why, the assistant said Armstrong had been under stress and may have made some inappropriate comments. They wanted to make sure nothing made it into the media. "Did your husband report what he heard?" "Not officially, but he told me he always wondered what Armstrong meant. Warned away by who and why?" The answer might have come from another source, a colleague of Armstrong's from his test pilot days who'd stayed in touch over the decades. The man, who asked not to be named, told Marcus about a conversation he'd had with Armstrong in the late 1990s. Neil was different after Apollo 11, the former pilot said. Quieter, more withdrawn. He did his public duties, but you could tell his heart wasn't in it. One day I asked him point blank, I said, "Neil, what really happened up there?" And he just looked at me with these tired eyes and said, "Some things are bigger than one man's conscience." What did he mean by that? I think he meant that he knew things the world should probably know, but that revealing them would cause more harm than good, or at least that's what he'd been convinced of. Part 12. The Final Evidence. Ernest Hale died on a Tuesday morning in late October, 4 months after his first meeting with Marcus. The cancer had progressed faster than the doctors predicted, but before he died, he made one final arrangement. Marcus received a package from Hale's attorney 3 days after the funeral. Inside was a small aluminum case, the kind used for storing film reels, and a handwritten note. "Marcus, if you're reading this, I've run out of time. Inside this case is the most important piece of evidence I managed to save. I've kept it hidden for 50 years, moving it from one secure location to another, always afraid someone would find it and destroy it. Now it's yours. Use it wisely. The truth matters more than my reputation or my legacy. Ernest." Inside the aluminum case was a 16mm film reel, carefully sealed in archival plastic. A label on the reel read, "Apollo 11, EVA restricted, do not duplicate." Marcus's hands trembled as he carefully removed the reel. He'd anticipated this moment, prepared for it by locating a restoration specialist who could safely digitize old film stock. 2 days later, he sat in the specialist's darkened studio and watched the film play on a modern screen. The footage was grainy, occasionally jumping and flickering with age, but it was unmistakably from the lunar surface. The perspective was from Armstrong's helmet camera, the same feed Hale had described seeing in the communications room. The timestamp in the corner showed 11:02 post-meridian Eastern Time, July 20th, 1969. The camera panned across the lunar landscape, grey regolith stretching to a sharp horizon against the black sky. Then the view shifted, focusing on a distant ridge. The image was shaky, affected by Armstrong's breathing and movement, but there was no mistaking what appeared in frame. 3 cylindrical structures, exactly as described in all the testimonies Marcus had gathered. They were metallic, catching the harsh sunlight and casting precise geometric shadows on the lunar surface. The centre structure appeared to be rotating slowly, its surface reflecting light in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic. Then the audio kicked in, scratchy and broken but audible. A voice, Armstrong's, tight with tension. "Houston, do you copy this feed?" Static, then another voice from Houston. "We copy, Eagle. Maintain visual contact." Armstrong again. "It's moving, the centre one, it's rotating toward my position." Another voice, Aldrin's, in the background. "Neil, it's tracking you, it's definitely tracking you." Houston. "Stand by, Eagle, we're analysing." The camera continued to focus on the structures for another 30 seconds. Then suddenly the centre structure seemed to flare with light, a brilliant reflection that washed out the camera for several frames. When the image cleared, the camera was pointed at the ground. Armstrong's breathing was audible, rapid and shallow. Houston. "Eagle, redirect to surface sample collection. Acknowledge." Armstrong. "Acknowledged." The footage ran for another 10 seconds, showing only lunar soil, then cut to black. Marcus watched the film 6 times in total, making detailed notes, capturing screenshots, ensuring he had documented every frame. This was it. Physical evidence of exactly what Hale, Aldrin, and the others had described. It wasn't proof of alien life, but it was undeniable proof that something anomalous had been present on the moon during Apollo 11, and that NASA had deliberately concealed it. But as Marcus prepared to publish his findings, as he compiled all the evidence he'd gathered over 6 months of intensive investigation, something happened that changed everything. Part 13. The Message. The email arrived at 3:37 in the morning, jolting Marcus awake with its notification chime. The sender was listed as Concerned Observer, and the subject line read, "Before you publish." Marcus opened it with growing dread. "Marcus Webb, we know what you found. We know about Hale's testimony, Klein's documents, the Aldrin interview and the film. We've been watching your investigation with interest. Before you make the decision to release this information publicly, you should know something that Ernest Hale didn't. you should know what Apollo 12 found at the Ocean of Storms. The email included a single attachment, a PDF file with a simple title, Surveyor 3 Recovery Mission, Classified Addendum. Apollo 12 had landed on the Moon in November 1969, just 4 months after Apollo 11. One of its mission objectives was to reach the Surveyor 3 probe, an unmanned lander that had touched down in April 1967. The astronauts successfully retrieved parts of Surveyor 3, bringing them back to Earth for analysis. That was the public story. The classified addendum told a very different tale. According to the document, when the Apollo 12 crew reached Surveyor 3, they found something unexpected. The probe had been moved, not by much, perhaps 15 feet from its original landing site, but it had definitely been relocated deliberately, carefully, and then set down in a new position. More disturbing, Surveyor 3's camera, which had been pointed west in all the original mission images from '67, was now pointed northeast, toward a series of geometric formations that hadn't been visible in the original photographs. The Apollo 12 crew had photographed these formations extensively, and the classified addendum included several of those images. They showed structures similar to what Armstrong and Aldrin had seen, cylindrical objects arranged in patterns, some partially buried in lunar regolith, others standing free. But there was one crucial difference. These structures appeared older, weathered, covered in the fine dust that accumulates on the lunar surface over time. The document concluded with a chilling assessment. Evidence suggests long-term presence of non-terrestrial technology on the lunar surface. Origin, purpose, and current operational status remain unknown. Recommend continued classified investigation and absolute suppression of public disclosure, pending comprehensive threat assessment. The email's message continued below the attachment. This is just the beginning, Marcus. Apollo 14 found more. Apollo 15 made contact. Apollo 16 was warned to leave. Apollo 17 discovered why. If you release what you know about Apollo 11, we will be forced to release the complete record. Are you prepared for the world to know everything? Think carefully about what you're about to do. The email ended with no signature, no contact information, no way to respond. Marcus sat in his dark apartment staring at the screen, his mind racing. The implication was clear. There was far more to the lunar cover-up than just Apollo 11. The evidence he'd gathered was just the tip of an iceberg that extended through the entire Apollo program and possibly beyond. If he published his Apollo 11 findings, whoever sent this email, presumably someone within the intelligence community, with access to the full classified record, would retaliate by releasing even more explosive information. Information about contact, about warnings, about discoveries that might fundamentally challenge humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Was he ready for that? Was the world ready for that? He thought about Ernest Hale, who'd spent 50 years carrying the weight of this secret, dying with the hope that the truth would finally emerge. He thought about the astronauts who'd been silenced, threatened, forced to deny what they'd witnessed. He thought about the public's right to know, weighed against the potential chaos that full disclosure might unleash. As dawn broke over his apartment window, Marcus sat at his computer, his article complete and ready to publish. Everything he'd found, every interview, every document, the film footage, all of it compiled into a comprehensive expose that would change history. His finger hovered over the publish button. On his other screen, the email from Concerned Observer remained open, its threat hanging in the digital air like a sword. If you release what you know about Apollo 11, we will release the complete record. Marcus Webb had spent his entire career searching for the truth, exposing secrets, bringing hidden information into the light. But now, faced with the biggest story of his life, he found himself paralyzed by a terrible question. What if some truths are too dangerous to tell? The cursor blinked on the screen. Publish. Don't publish. The choice that would define his legacy and possibly humanity's future. Outside, the sun rose over another ordinary day, in a world that had no idea what secrets lurked in the shadows of its greatest achievement. Marcus's finger remained frozen over the keyboard. The film reel sat in its aluminum case on his desk. 3 cylindrical structures captured forever on 16mm film, rotating slowly under an alien sun, watching, waiting, as they had been for 50 years. And somewhere in the classified archives of the United States government, the complete record of humanity's first contact waited in the darkness, neither confirmed nor denied, neither revealed nor forgotten, existing in that strange quantum state of truth that is simultaneously known and unknown, believed and doubted, terrifying and magnificent. The story of Apollo 11, the transmission they never released, remained balanced on the edge of revelation, as close to the light as it had ever been, and yet still shrouded in the same shadows that had concealed it since that July day in 1969, when 3 men looked up at structures on a lunar ridge and had their reality forever transformed. Marcus Webb stared at his screen, the weight of history pressing down on him, the future hanging in the balance, and the cursor blinked. Publish. Don't publish. The choice was his alone, but the truth, whatever it was, wherever it led, continued to exist independent of his decision, waiting in the lunar dust, patient and eternal for the day when humanity would finally be ready to face what it had found among the stars. Good evening, and welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I'm curious about you, our listeners. How has your day been treating you? Are you winding down after a long day? Or perhaps you're on the other side of the world, just beginning your morning routine? What time is it where you are right now? And what corner of our vast planet are you calling home tonight? Whether you're listening from a bustling city apartment, a quiet countryside home, or somewhere in between, you're part of our global community of truth seekers and story lovers. If you're new to Sleep Theories, welcome aboard. And if you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We have so many more mysteries to uncover together, and your subscription helps us bring these stories to light. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a tale that will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's most famous disasters. Tonight, we're going beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, not just to explore the wreckage of a legendary ship, but to uncover a conspiracy so massive, so carefully orchestrated, that it may have shaped the course of world history. This is the story of the Titanic switch, the theory that suggests the ship that sank on that fateful April night in 1912 was never the Titanic at all. April 14th, 1912. Picture this night in your mind. The North Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction, a black mirror reflecting nothing but stars. There is no moon to illuminate the waters, leaving the ocean in an almost supernatural darkness. The temperature has dropped to just below freezing, and the sea is unusually calm, so still that veterans of these waters would later describe it as eerily unnatural. Cutting through this obsidian expanse is the largest moving object ever created by human hands. The RMS Titanic, all 882 feet of her, pushes through the water at nearly 23 knots. Her 4 massive smokestacks pierce the star-filled sky, sending columns of smoke and sparks into the night. From her decks, the warm glow of electric light spills out onto the water, creating the only source of illumination for miles in any direction. Inside this floating palace, over 2,000 souls are living what many believe to be their final hours, though they don't know it yet. In the first-class dining saloon, passengers in evening wear are finishing their 10-course dinner, completely unaware that they are dining aboard what will become history's most famous maritime disaster. The ship's orchestra plays ragtime melodies that drift through the corridors, mixing with the sound of laughter, conversation, and the ever-present thrumming of the engines deep below. Captain Edward Smith stands on the bridge, a veteran of the seas with 40 years of experience behind him. This is meant to be his final voyage before retirement, a triumphant capstone to a distinguished career. He has commanded ships for the White Star Line for decades, earning the nickname Millionaire's Captain for his skill in handling the luxury vessels that carry the world's elite across the Atlantic. Tonight he commands not just any ship, but the crown jewel of the White Star Line fleet, the unsinkable Titanic. But at 11:39 p.m. ship's time, everything changes in an instant. Frederick Fleet, the lookout stationed in the crow's nest, spots something emerging from the darkness ahead. Without the aid of binoculars, which, mysteriously, are locked away and unavailable to the lookouts that night, he strains his eyes against the blackness. What he sees sends ice through his veins. A massive iceberg, dark and silent, looms directly in the ship's path. "Iceberg right ahead," Fleet shouts into the telephone that connects him to the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch receives the warning and immediately orders hard a starboard and full astern. The helmsman spins the wheel, and the engine room receives the telegraph signal to reverse engines. For 37 seconds, the fate of over 2,000 people hangs in the balance as the massive ship begins to turn. But it's too late. The Titanic's starboard side scrapes along the iceberg with what survivors would later describe as a sound like thunder, though to many passengers it felt like nothing more than a slight shudder. Some passengers on the lower decks report chunks of ice falling onto the deck, and a few even gather pieces as souvenirs, joking about their close call with the ice. They have no idea that their ship is already doomed. Below the waterline, the iceberg has opened up the first 5 compartments of the ship's hull. The Titanic was designed to survive flooding in up to 4 compartments, but 5 is too many. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who is aboard for this maiden voyage, quickly calculates the mathematics of disaster. With 5 compartments flooding, the ship will inevitably sink by the bow, pulling the rest of the vessel down with her. "How long do we have?" Captain Smith asks Andrews. "An hour, 2 at most." And so begins one of the most studied, documented and debated disasters in human history. Over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, the unsinkable ship will break apart and slip beneath the waves, taking with her over 1,500 souls. The survivors will tell stories of heroism and cowardice, of the band playing hymns as the ship tilted toward her grave, of the insufficient lifeboats and the icy water that killed most victims within minutes. This is the story we all know. This is the official narrative that has been told and retold for over a century. But what if everything we think we know about that night is wrong? What if the ship that struck the iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic was never the Titanic at all? What if the real conspiracy began not in the aftermath of the disaster, but months before, in the shipyards of Belfast, where 2 sister ships sat side by side and where a desperate plan was hatched to save a failing company from financial ruin? What if the disaster that shocked the world was not an accident, but the culmination of the most audacious insurance fraud ever attempted? Tonight, we're going to explore a theory that suggests the Titanic disaster was not just a tragedy, but a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving some of the most powerful men in the world. We're going to examine evidence that points to a massive cover-up, one that may have claimed the lives of over 1,500 innocent people in service of greed, power, and political manipulation. This is the story of the Titanic switch, and by the end of our journey together, you may never look at this famous disaster the same way again. To understand the theory of the Titanic switch, we must first travel back to the shipyards of Belfast Island, where 2 virtually identical ships were taking shape side by side. The story begins not with disaster, but with dreams of maritime supremacy and the fierce competition between the great shipping lines of the early 20th century. Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast was, at the time, one of the premier shipbuilding facilities in the world. The massive facility sprawled along the banks of the River Lagan, its enormous gantry cranes towering over the landscape like steel monuments to industrial ambition. It was here, in this cathedral of steel and rivets, that the White Star Line had commissioned 3 ships that would change ocean travel forever. The Olympic-class ships, as they would be known, were conceived as the ultimate expression of luxury and engineering prowess. These were to be the largest, most opulent vessels ever built, designed to dominate the lucrative North Atlantic passenger route and crush the competition from rival shipping companies like Cunard Line. The first of these sister ships was the RMS Olympic, launched on October the 20th, 1910. She was a marvel of engineering, stretching 882 feet from bow to stern and weighing over 46,000 tons. Her 9 decks could accommodate over 2,000 passengers in unprecedented luxury, with amenities that included a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a Turkish bath, and dining rooms that rivaled the finest restaurants in London or New York. The Olympic was not just a ship. She was a floating city, a testament to British engineering and a symbol of the White Star Line's dominance of the seas. When she departed Southampton on her maiden voyage in June 1911, she carried with her the hopes and reputation of her builders. But less than 4 months after her maiden voyage, disaster struck. On September the 20th, 1911, the Olympic was departing Southampton when she collided with HMS Hawke, a Royal Navy cruiser. The impact was devastating. The Hawke's reinforced bow, designed to ram enemy vessels, punched a massive hole in the Olympic's starboard side, flooding 2 of her compartments and severely damaging her propeller shaft. The Olympic limped back to port, her maiden voyage season cut dramatically short. But the damage was far more extensive than initially apparent. When she was dry docked for inspection, the full extent of the catastrophe became clear. The collision had not only opened up her hull and damaged her propeller, but it had also twisted her keel, the backbone of the ship, potentially compromising her structural integrity for the remainder of her operational life. For the White Star Line, this was nothing short of a financial disaster. The Olympic had cost over $7.5 million to build, an astronomical sum in 1911. Now she faced months of expensive repairs, and even after those repairs, questions would remain about her seaworthiness and insurability. But the problems went deeper than just the cost of repairs. The collision with HMS Hawke had occurred under circumstances that placed the Olympic at fault. Captain Edward Smith, yes, the same Captain Smith who would later command the Titanic on her fatal voyage, had been in charge of the Olympic when the accident occurred. The subsequent Admiralty Court inquiry found the Olympic to blame for the collision, meaning that the White Star Line would receive no insurance compensation for the damage. This left the company facing a nightmare scenario. They had an expensive ship that needed costly repairs, no insurance money to pay for those repairs, and serious questions about whether insurance companies would be willing to fully cover the vessel in the future. The Olympic had gone from being the crown jewel of the White Star Line fleet to a massive financial liability virtually overnight. Meanwhile, in the same Belfast shipyard where the Olympic was undergoing her repairs, work was proceeding on her sister ship, the RMS Titanic. The Titanic was planned to be virtually identical to her older sister, with only minor modifications and improvements. From a distance, even expert ship observers would have difficulty telling the 2 vessels apart. They shared the same basic dimensions, the same general layout, the same distinctive 4-funnel silhouette that had become the signature of the White Star Line's premium vessels. This similarity, according to the switch theory, was not coincidental. It was the key to a plan that would solve the White Star Line's financial crisis, while simultaneously eliminating a massive liability. The theory suggests that sometime in late 1911 or early 1912, a decision was made at the highest levels of the White Star Line's ownership. Rather than spend millions repairing the Olympic and then operating her under a cloud of doubt about her structural integrity and insurability, they would swap the identities of the 2 ships. the damaged Olympic would be given the identity of the Titanic and sent out on what was ostensibly the new ship's maiden voyage. But this voyage would not be intended to reach New York. Instead, the disguised Olympic would be deliberately sunk, allowing the White Star Line to collect the full insurance value of a new undamaged vessel while simultaneously eliminating the financial burden of the real Titanic's damaged sister. Meanwhile, the real Titanic, now disguised as the Olympic, would quietly slip into service, her true identity hidden from the world. To understand why such a plan might have been attractive, we must consider the financial pressures facing the White Star Line in 1912. The company was owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company, a shipping trust controlled by American financier J.P. Morgan. Morgan had invested enormous sums in his shipping empire, but the business was facing increasing competition and declining profitability. The White Star Line needed the Titanic to be a success. They needed her to capture public imagination, dominate the headlines, and establish the company's supremacy on the North Atlantic route. But they also needed to resolve the Olympic problem before it bankrupted the entire operation. According to the switch theory, the solution was as elegant as it was terrible. Switch the ships, sink the damaged one while pretending it was the new one, collect the insurance money, and use the real new ship to rebuild the company's reputation and finances. The theory suggests that the work done on both ships during the winter of 1911 and 1912 was not routine maintenance and completion, but rather an elaborate process of swapping their identities. Features that differed between the ships would need to be altered. Documentation would need to be changed or destroyed. Most importantly, the workers involved would need to be either brought into the conspiracy or kept unaware of what they were truly doing. Harland and Wolff employed thousands of workers, and the shipyard was a maze of activity with multiple vessels under construction and repair simultaneously. In such an environment, it would be possible to make alterations to both ships without arousing suspicion, especially if the changes were explained as routine modifications or improvements. The workers who might notice discrepancies could be told they were simply upgrading the Olympic to match improvements made to the Titanic design, or vice versa. Only a handful of people at the very top of the hierarchy would need to know the true purpose of the work being done. But for such a plan to succeed, it would require more than just physical alterations to the ships. It would require careful planning of the disaster itself, ensuring that the right people were aboard and the right people were not, and that the sinking would occur in circumstances that would prevent too close an examination of the evidence. The switch theory suggests that every detail of the Titanic's maiden voyage was planned not to showcase a magnificent new ship, but to destroy an old damaged one while making it appear to be an accident. The passenger list, the route, the timing, even the crew assignments, all of these, according to the theory, were carefully orchestrated to serve the conspiracy. As we'll see, the evidence for this incredible claim goes far beyond simple speculation. There are photographs that seem to show differences between the ship that left Belfast and the ship that left Southampton. There are testimony from shipyard workers who noticed unusual modifications being made. There are suspicious cancellations by wealthy passengers who had every reason to want to be aboard the maiden voyage of the most famous ship ever built. Most tellingly, there are the financial motivations of the men who controlled the White Star Line. Men who stood to lose millions if the Olympic problem was not resolved, and who stood to gain millions if a carefully planned disaster could eliminate their problems while simultaneously collecting insurance payments. But before we examine that evidence, we need to understand exactly who these men were and just how much money was at stake in 1912. We need to understand the insurance motive that may have driven over 1,500 people to their deaths in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Money. In the end, according to the switch theory, that's what the Titanic disaster was really about. Not the romance of the sea, not the hubris of calling a ship unsinkable, not even the class divisions that the disaster seemed to highlight. It was about money, enormous amounts of money that stood to be lost or gained depending on the fate of two ships and the decisions of a few powerful men. To understand the financial pressures that may have driven the conspiracy, we need to understand the business empire of one man, John Pierpont Morgan, the American financier who controlled more wealth and power than perhaps any individual in the history of capitalism. J.P. Morgan was not just wealthy, he was a force of nature in the world of early 20th century finance. His banking house, J.P. Morgan and Company, had financed railroads, steel companies, and industrial empires. He had personally intervened to prevent financial panics, earning him the nickname America's Bank. When the federal government needed money, they came to J.P. Morgan. When major corporations needed capital, they came to J.P. Morgan. By 1912, he controlled assets worth billions in today's currency. But Morgan's empire was not limited to American shores. In 1902, he had founded the International Mercantile Marine Company, a shipping trust designed to dominate transatlantic passenger and cargo traffic. The IM acquired control of numerous shipping lines, including the prestigious White Star Line, Morgan's crown jewel in maritime transportation. The White Star Line was the perfect fit for Morgan's vision. Founded in 1845, it had built its reputation on providing luxury service to affluent passengers crossing between Europe and America. The company's ships were known for their elegance, comfort, and safety record. When Morgan acquired control, he saw an opportunity to create the ultimate expression of luxury travel while generating enormous profits. This vision led directly to the commissioning of the Olympic-class ships. Morgan intended these vessels to be more than just transportation. They would be floating advertisements for the supremacy of his shipping empire. The Olympic, Titanic, and the planned third sister ship Britannic would capture the public imagination and establish IMM as the unquestioned leader in North Atlantic travel. The financial investment was staggering. Each ship cost approximately $7.5 million to build, roughly $200 million in today's currency. The Olympic alone represented an investment larger than the annual budget of many small nations. For the three ships combined, Morgan was risking an amount of money that could have funded a small war. But the potential profits were equally enormous. The North Atlantic passenger route was one of the most lucrative transportation businesses in the world. Wealthy Americans travelling to Europe for business or pleasure were willing to pay premium prices for luxury accommodations. European aristocrats and businessmen crossing to America represented another steady stream of high-paying customers. Immigrants seeking new lives in America provided volume traffic that, while individually less profitable, generated substantial revenue in aggregate. Morgan calculated that the Olympic-class ships would not only dominate this market but expand it. By offering unprecedented luxury and reliability, he could charge premium prices while attracting new customers who had never before considered ocean travel. The ships would pay for themselves within a few years, and then generate enormous profits for decades to come. This was the dream. The reality, as we've seen, was somewhat different. When the Olympic collided with HMS Hawke in September 1911, Morgan's carefully calculated investment began to unravel. The ship that was supposed to be generating revenue was instead sitting in dry dock, requiring expensive repairs. Worse, the legal finding that the Olympic was at fault for the collision meant that insurance would not cover the costs of those repairs. But the problems went beyond just the immediate cost of fixing the damage. The Olympic's accident raised serious questions about the ship's design and safety. If one of these supposedly superior vessels could be so easily damaged in a collision with a smaller ship, what did that say about their construction? More importantly for Morgan's business model, what did it say about their insurability? Insurance was critical to the economics of ship operation. No shipping company could afford to operate vessels worth millions of dollars without comprehensive insurance coverage. But insurance companies were in the business of managing risk, and a ship that had already demonstrated vulnerability might be difficult to insure at reasonable rates. The switch theory suggests that by late 1911, Morgan and his associates realized they faced a potential disaster that went far beyond the cost of repairing one ship. If insurance companies began to question the safety and reliability of the Olympic-class design, it could affect the insurability and profitability of the entire fleet. The Titanic, still under construction, might face higher insurance premiums or coverage limitations based on her sister ship's problems. Even worse, if the Olympic's structural damage was more extensive than initially apparent, the ship might prove to be uneconomical to operate even after repairs. a ship with a damaged keel might suffer from ongoing problems with stability, fuel efficiency, or structural integrity. She might require more frequent and expensive maintenance, reducing her profitability and potentially shortening her operational life. In this context, the switch theory proposes the idea of swapping the ship's identities became attractive, not just as a way to collect insurance money, but as a way to solve multiple problems simultaneously. By sinking the damaged Olympic while disguised as the Titanic, the conspiracy would eliminate the problematic vessel while collecting insurance payments based on the value of a new, undamaged ship. The insurance money would not only compensate for the Olympic's construction costs, but would also provide capital to complete the real Titanic and put her into profitable service. Meanwhile, the real Titanic, now operating under the Olympic's identity, would begin generating revenue immediately. Any questions about the Olympic's performance could be explained away as improvements made during her repair period. The beauty of the plan, from a financial standpoint, was that it transformed a major liability into a substantial asset. Instead of losing money on repairs and operating a damaged ship of questionable profitability, the conspiracy would collect full insurance value for a total loss while simultaneously putting an undamaged vessel into service. But for such a plan to work, the insurance aspects would need to be carefully managed. The Titanic was insured for £650,000, approximately $75 million in today's currency. This was a substantial amount, but it was less than the ship's actual construction cost, partly because insurance values were typically set below replacement cost to discourage fraudulent claims. However, the insurance money would still represent a significant recovery of Morgan's investment. Combined with the revenues that the real Titanic could generate while operating as the Olympic, the financial benefits of the switch could potentially exceed the total cost of both ships. The theory also suggests that the conspiracy would have additional financial benefits beyond the immediate insurance recovery. By eliminating the Olympic's problems, Morgan could proceed with his plans for the third sister ship, Britannic, without the cloud of questions about the class's design and safety. The successful maiden voyage of the Titanic would generate publicity and confidence that would benefit the entire White Star Line fleet. But perhaps most intriguingly, the switch theory proposes that the financial motive may have extended beyond simple insurance fraud. Some versions of the theory suggest that the disaster was timed to coincide with other events that would benefit Morgan's broader financial interests. In 1913, just 1 year after the Titanic disaster, the United States Federal Reserve System was established. This new central banking system fundamentally changed how American finance operated, and J.P. Morgan was one of its strongest supporters. The Federal Reserve centralized control of American monetary policy and created new opportunities for the kind of large-scale financial manipulation that Morgan specialized in. However, Morgan faced opposition to the Federal Reserve from some quarters, including wealthy Americans who preferred the existing decentralized system. Some of these opponents happened to be aboard the Titanic when she sank. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune and a vocal critic of centralized banking, went down with the ship. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store and another Federal Reserve opponent, died along with his wife. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest Americans and a skeptic of Morgan's financial schemes, also perished in the disaster. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan himself, who had booked passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage, cancelled his trip at the last minute citing illness. Several of Morgan's business associates and political allies also cancelled their bookings while his opponents sailed to their deaths. This aspect of the theory suggests that the Titanic disaster may have served multiple purposes for Morgan. Not only did it solve his immediate problem with the Olympic and provide insurance money, but it also eliminated some of his most powerful opponents in the debate over American financial policy. Whether or not this political dimension was part of the original plan, the financial motive alone would have been sufficient to drive such a conspiracy. Morgan stood to lose millions if the Olympic problem was not resolved, and he stood to gain millions if a carefully orchestrated disaster could eliminate his problems while collecting insurance payments. The amounts of money involved were so large that they could influence the decisions of governments and the fate of thousands of people. In the world of early 20th century finance, where a handful of men controlled wealth comparable to entire national budgets, the lives of 1,500 passengers might have seemed like acceptable collateral damage in service of a larger financial strategy. But money and motive alone do not prove a conspiracy. For the switch theory to be credible, there must be physical evidence that the ships were actually swapped. There must be documentation, photographs, and testimony that support the claim that the vessel that sank was not the Titanic but her damaged sister. As we'll see in the next chapter, proponents of the switch theory claim that such evidence exists, hidden in plain sight in photographs, construction records, and the testimony of those who were present when the conspiracy was allegedly carried out. The human eye, they say, can be deceived. Photographs, however, do not lie. They capture reality with mechanical precision, preserving details that witnesses might forget or misremember. For proponents of the switch theory, photographic evidence forms the backbone of their case that the ship which sank on April 15, 1912, was not the Titanic, but her sister ship, the Olympic. To understand this evidence, we must first appreciate just how similar the Olympic and Titanic actually were. Both ships were built from virtually identical blueprints, with the same overall dimensions, the same basic layout, and the same distinctive four-funnel profile. From a distance, even maritime experts would have difficulty distinguishing between them. However, they were not absolutely identical. The Titanic incorporated several design improvements based on experience gained from the Olympic's early service. More importantly, she included modifications specifically requested by passengers and crew who had sailed on the Olympic and identified areas for improvement. These differences, while minor, were distinctive enough that they could be identified by careful observers. And according to switch theory proponents, photographs of the ship that left Southampton on April 10, 1912, show features that match the Olympic rather than the Titanic. The most frequently cited difference involves the porthole arrangements on a deck, the ship's uppermost passenger deck. The original Titanic plans showed 16 portholes along the forward section of this deck. The Olympic, however, had been built with only 15 portholes in the same area. When the Olympic was being repaired after her collision with HMS Hawke, the damaged area included part of this porthole arrangement. Photographs taken of the Olympic during her repair period show workmen modifying the porthole configuration in this section. Switch theory proponents claim that these modifications were made to match the Titanic's 16 porthole design, as part of the process of disguising the Olympic as her sister ship. However, photographs of the ship that departed Southampton on the Titanic's supposed maiden voyage show only 15 portholes in the critical area, matching the Olympic's original configuration, rather than the Titanic's planned design. This discrepancy might seem minor, but it's precisely the kind of detail that would be difficult to alter quickly and completely. Changing porthole arrangements required cutting through the ship's steel hull and then reinforcing and refinishing the area. It was exactly the sort of modification that might be overlooked in a hasty effort to swap the ship's identities. Another frequently cited difference involves the arrangement of the ship's lifeboats. The Olympic and Titanic were built with slightly different davit systems, mechanical devices used to lower lifeboats into the water. The Titanic was designed with a newer, more efficient davit arrangement that allowed for quicker deployment of the boats. Photographs of the ship at Southampton show what appear to be the older style davits consistent with the Olympic's original configuration. Switch theory proponents argue that the newer davits planned for the Titanic were never installed because the ship that sailed was actually the disguised Olympic. This detail takes on additional significance when considered alongside survivor testimony about the difficulty experienced in launching lifeboats during the disaster. Several witnesses reported problems with the davit mechanisms, delays in getting boats into the water, and confusion about the operation of the launching equipment. If the ship was actually the Olympic with her old davit systems, such problems might explain some of the difficulties experienced during the evacuation. More controversial is evidence related to the ship's propeller systems. The Olympic suffered significant damage to her centre propeller shaft during the collision with HMS Hawke. Repairs to this system were complex and expensive, requiring removal and replacement of major components. Some switch theory proponents claim that rather than properly repairing the Olympic's propeller system, the damaged components were simply patched or temporarily fixed. They argue that the ship that sailed from Southampton had a compromised propulsion system that would have affected her handling and manoeuvrability. This claim is supported, they suggest, by testimony from passengers who noted that the ship seemed to vibrate unusually during the voyage, and by reports that the ship was not achieving her expected speed. If the Titanic was actually the Olympic with a damaged propeller system, these performance issues would be explained. Perhaps more significant than these technical details are the human testimonies from those who worked on the ships. Several workers at Harland and Wolff reported unusual activity during the winter months when both ships were in the shipyard together. James Fenton, a painter who worked on both vessels, later claimed that he noticed significant work being done to modify the Olympic during what was supposedly a routine repair period. According to Fenton, workers were making changes that seemed to go far beyond fixing collision damage. They were altering features of the ship that had nothing to do with the areas damaged in the Hawke incident. Fenton specifically mentioned work being done on the Olympic's passenger accommodations, including modifications to cabin layouts and public room configurations. He claimed that these changes seemed designed to make the Olympic more closely resemble the Titanic's interior arrangements. Even more intriguingly, Fenton reported that workers were instructed to swap various brass fittings and fixtures between the two ships. Nameplates, cabin numbers, and other identifying features were removed from both vessels and apparently switched. When Fenton asked supervisors about this work, he was told it was part of standardising equipment between the sister ships. Another shipyard worker, Robert Hichens, reported seeing unusual activity in the area where the ships' names were painted on their hulls. According to Hichens, the name plates and hull markings on both ships were removed and replaced during the repair period. He assumed this was routine maintenance, but later wondered whether something more significant was happening. Perhaps most compelling is testimony from John Halpin, a shipfitter who worked on both vessels. Halpin claimed that he was specifically assigned to work on swapping interior fittings between the Olympic and the ship under construction that was supposedly the Titanic. He was told that this was being done to upgrade the Olympic with improvements developed for her sister ship. However, Halpin noticed that the work seemed to go both ways. Features from the Olympic were also being installed on the other ship. When he questioned this, supervisors told him that they were standardising the designs to make maintenance and operation more efficient. Only years later, after the disaster, did Halpin begin to suspect that the work he'd been assigned might have been part of a larger deception. He realised that the extensive swapping of components between the ships could have been part of a process of switching their identities entirely. These worker testimonies are supported by documentary evidence from the shipyard. Harland and Wolff's work records from the winter of 1911 to 1912 show extensive modifications being made to both ships. While much of this work was clearly related to repairing the Olympic's collision damage, some entries describe tasks that seem unrelated to the repairs. For example, records show work being done on both ships' passenger cabin configurations, dining room layouts, and recreational facilities. This work is described in vague terms that make it difficult to determine exactly what was being done, but the volume of interior modification seems excessive for routine maintenance or repair work. More suspicious are gaps in the documentation. Several weeks' worth of work records are missing from the shipyard files, apparently lost or destroyed. The missing records cover precisely the period when the most extensive work was being done on both ships. Additionally, some surviving records contain unusual notations and corrections that suggest original entries were altered or replaced. Work orders that originally specified tasks for the Olympic appear to have been changed to specify the same work for the Titanic and vice versa. Switch theory proponents also point to photographic evidence from inside the ships. Comparison of interior photographs taken during construction with photographs taken aboard the ship that sailed from Southampton reveals several discrepancies. The most notable differences involve the first-class dining room and the grand staircase. The Olympic's dining room was originally designed with a specific pattern of decorative panels and light fixtures. The Titanic was planned to have an improved version of the same space, with subtle but distinctive differences in the decorative scheme. Photographs taken aboard the ship at Southampton show decorative features that match the Olympic's original design, rather than the improvements planned for the Titanic. Similarly, details of the grand staircase appear to match the Olympic's configuration, rather than the Titanic's planned modifications. These interior discrepancies are particularly significant because they would be difficult to fake or alter after the disaster. Unlike exterior features that might be changed by salvage operations or natural deterioration, interior photographs taken before the voyage provide a permanent record of the ship's actual configuration. However, the most dramatic physical evidence cited by switch theory proponents involves the ship's construction numbers. Every vessel built by Harland and Wolff was assigned a unique yard number that was stamped or engraved on various components throughout the ship. These numbers served as permanent identification that could not be easily altered or forged. The Olympic was assigned yard number 301. The Titanic was assigned yard number 3909. According to the theory, components with the Olympic's number should have been found on the wreck if it was actually the Titanic that sank. When the Titanic wreck was discovered in 1985, some of the recovered artifacts did indeed show construction numbers. However, examining these numbers has proven difficult due to the condition of the wreck and the limited access to recovered materials. Some switch theory proponents claim that construction numbers found on wreck components match the Olympic rather than the Titanic, but this claim is disputed by maritime historians and wreck researchers. The numbers are often partially obscured or damaged, making definitive identification difficult. More recently, some researchers have used advanced imaging techniques to examine construction details on the wreck itself. These studies have identified several features that appear to match the Olympic's configuration rather than the Titanic's planned design. For example, the propeller arrangement on the wreck appears to show evidence of the repair work done to the Olympic's damaged propulsion system. The centre propeller, which should have been a 3-blade design on the Titanic, appears to be a 4-blade configuration that matches repairs made to the Olympic. Similarly, hull plates in areas that should have been newly constructed for the Titanic show evidence of previous damage and repair that would be consistent with the Olympic's collision damage. However, these findings are highly technical and disputed by many experts. The condition of the wreck after more than a century on the ocean floor makes definitive identification of small details extremely difficult. Corrosion, collapse, and damage from the sinking itself have obscured many of the features that might provide conclusive evidence. The physical evidence for the switch theory remains controversial and disputed. While proponents point to numerous discrepancies between the ship that sailed and the ship that was supposed to sail, skeptics argue that these differences can be explained by changes made during construction, errors in documentation, or misinterpretation of photographic evidence. What is not disputed is that significant work was done on both ships during the winter of 1911 to 1912, that modifications were made that went beyond simple repair work, and that there are photographic and documentary discrepancies that have never been fully explained. Whether these discrepancies prove a conspiracy or simply reflect the normal complexities of building and modifying massive ships remains a matter of debate. But for switch theory proponents, the physical evidence forms a compelling case that something was not right about the ship that sailed from Southampton on that April morning in 1912. However, physical evidence is only part of the story. To truly understand the scope of the alleged conspiracy, we must examine not just what was done to the ships, but who was aboard them. The passenger list of the Titanic's final voyage contains names that would reshape the world of finance and politics, and according to the theory, this was no coincidence. Sometimes the most revealing evidence is not what happened, but who was present when it happened. In the case of the Titanic disaster, the passenger manifest reads like a who's who of early 20th century power and influence. But according to the switch theory, this prestigious passenger list was not assembled by chance. Instead, it was carefully curated to serve the purposes of a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple insurance fraud. To understand the significance of the Titanic's passengers, we must first understand the broader context of American politics and finance in 1912. The United States was on the verge of fundamental changes in how its financial system operated. The country had experienced several financial panics in recent decades, and there was growing pressure to create a more stable and centralized banking system. J.P. Morgan and his allies favored the creation of a central bank that would be controlled by major financial institutions. This system, which would eventually become the Federal Reserve, would give unprecedented power to a small group of bankers and financiers. They would control the nation's money supply, interest rates, and credit availability. However, this plan faced significant opposition from wealthy Americans who preferred the existing decentralized system. These opponents feared that a central bank controlled by Morgan and his associates would concentrate too much financial power in too few hands. They argued for maintaining a system where multiple independent banks could compete and where no single institution could dominate the nation's finances. The debate over banking reform was not merely academic. Billions of dollars in wealth and decades of political power hung in the balance. If Morgan's vision prevailed, he and his allies would control the financial destiny of the United States. If his opponents succeeded in blocking the plan, Morgan's influence would be significantly diminished. Into this high-stakes political battle sailed the Titanic, carrying some of the most influential participants in the banking debate. And remarkably, almost all of the Federal Reserve's most powerful opponents happened to be aboard, while Morgan and his supporters were conspicuously absent. The most prominent opponent aboard was Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to one of America's great mining fortunes. The Guggenheim family controlled vast mineral resources and had accumulated enormous wealth through copper, silver and gold mining operations around the world. Benjamin was not just wealthy but politically influential, serving on the boards of multiple corporations and maintaining extensive connections in Washington. Guggenheim had been a vocal critic of Morgan's banking proposals. He argued that a centralized system would stifle competition and innovation in American finance. He favored maintaining the existing system of independent banks and opposed giving any single institution the power to control the nation's money supply. On the night of April 14th, as the Titanic began to sink, Benjamin Guggenheim reportedly dressed in his finest evening clothes and told fellow passengers, "We are prepared to go down like gentlemen." His body was never recovered. Also aboard was Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store and another influential voice in American business. Straus had built his retail empire through careful management and conservative financial practices. He distrusted the kind of financial manipulation that Morgan specialized in and opposed the creation of a central bank that would facilitate such practices. Straus was particularly concerned about the impact of centralized banking on smaller businesses. He argued that a Morgan-controlled central bank would favor large corporations at the expense of independent merchants and entrepreneurs. His opposition to the Federal Reserve Plan was well known in political circles. When the Titanic began to sink, Isidore and his wife Ida were offered places in a lifeboat. According to witnesses, Ida refused to leave her husband, saying, "We have lived together for 40 years. Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs as the ship tilted toward her final plunge. Neither body was ever found. Perhaps most significant was the presence of John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest Americans and a man whose financial influence rivaled Morgan's own. Astor had inherited a vast real estate empire and had expanded it into hotels, railroads, and other investments. His personal fortune was estimated at over $87 million, roughly $2 billion in today's currency. Astor was not merely wealthy, but politically sophisticated. He understood the implications of Morgan's banking proposals and opposed them on both economic and political grounds. He argued that giving Morgan's group control over the nation's banking system would create a financial oligarchy that would undermine American democratic institutions. More than any other individual, Astor had the wealth and influence to effectively oppose Morgan's plans. His opposition carried weight in Congress and in the financial community. If anyone could have blocked the creation of the Federal Reserve, it was John Jacob Astor IV. Astor was travelling on the Titanic with his pregnant young wife, Madeline. When the ship began to sink, he helped her into a lifeboat but was refused passage himself under the Women and Children First protocol. His body was recovered days later, reportedly with his gold watch still in his pocket and over $2,000 in cash. His death eliminated one of the most powerful obstacles to Morgan's banking ambitions. These three men, Guggenheim, Straus and Astor, represented the core of wealthy American opposition to the Federal Reserve Plan. Their combined influence, both financial and political, posed a serious threat to Morgan's vision of centralised banking control. Their deaths removed major obstacles to the passage of Federal Reserve legislation. But the passenger list's significance extends beyond these three prominent figures. Several other Titanic passengers had connections to the banking debate or to Morgan's business interests. Some were allies who might have provided testimony or support that could have been problematic for the conspiracy. Others were neutral parties whose presence might have been seen as providing legitimacy to the voyage. The theory suggests that the passenger list was carefully managed to ensure that the right people were aboard and the wrong people were not. Key figures in the banking debate who opposed Morgan were encouraged or induced to sail, while those who might have interfered with the plan were kept away. This management allegedly extended to the crew assignments as well. Captain Edward Smith, who commanded the ship, was nearing retirement, and may have been chosen partly because his career was ending anyway. If he survived the disaster, he would soon be out of the shipping business and less likely to cause problems. If he didn't survive, his death would be seen as a heroic sacrifice, rather than evidence of conspiracy. Other key crew members were reportedly chosen for their loyalty to the White Star Line or their lack of detailed knowledge about the ship's construction. Engineers and officers who might have been able to identify discrepancies between the Olympic and Titanic were either not assigned to the voyage or were placed in positions where they would be unlikely to survive if something went wrong. Perhaps most tellingly, J.P. Morgan himself had originally booked passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage. As the owner of the shipping line and the man whose vision the voyage was meant to showcase, Morgan's presence would have been expected and appropriate. His cabin had been reserved, his passage confirmed, and his attendance at various social events planned. But at the last minute, Morgan cancelled his trip, citing illness. He claimed to be suffering from a minor ailment that prevented him from travelling, and he remained in France where he had been vacationing. Remarkably, several of Morgan's close business associates also cancelled their bookings at the last minute, citing various personal and business reasons. The pattern of cancellations was so notable that it attracted attention even at the time. Several newspapers commented on the unusual number of prominent businessmen who had changed their travel plans. Some observers wondered whether there might have been advance warning of problems with the ship or the voyage. Morgan's cancellation is particularly suspicious because he was photographed in apparently good health at a French resort just days after the disaster. He showed no signs of the illness that had supposedly prevented him from travelling, and he resumed his normal activities immediately after learning of the Titanic's fate. Even more suspicious were the cancellations by Morgan's business partners. Henry Clay Frick, the steel magnate and longtime Morgan ally, had booked passage but cancelled, citing his wife's health. George Washington Vanderbilt II, another Morgan associate, also cancelled his booking at the last minute. Milton Hershey, the chocolate manufacturer who had business relationships with Morgan's interests, similarly changed his travel plans. The pattern suggests that Morgan and his inner circle knew something that the general passengers did not. Whether they had advanced knowledge of the planned disaster or simply knew that the ship was not safe due to the identity switch, they took steps to avoid being aboard when the conspiracy was carried out. Meanwhile, Morgan's opponents in the banking debate sailed to their deaths, apparently unaware of the danger they faced. The convenient elimination of the Federal Reserve's most powerful critics cleared the way for the legislation that Morgan had been promoting. Indeed, the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress in December 1913, less than 2 years after the Titanic disaster. The legislation created the central banking system that Morgan had long advocated, giving him and his associates unprecedented control over American finance. The deaths of Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss had removed the most influential voices that might have prevented this outcome. Some versions of the switch theory go even further, suggesting that the passenger list was managed not just to eliminate political opponents, but also to provide witnesses who would support the official story of the disaster. Certain passengers and crew members who survived the sinking provided testimony that reinforced the narrative of an accidental collision with an iceberg. These survivors described the impact, the flooding, and the sinking in ways that supported the insurance claims and deflected suspicion from the possibility of sabotage or deliberate destruction. Their accounts helped establish the official version of events that has persisted for over a century. However, other survivors provided testimony that was less helpful to the official narrative. Some reported hearing explosions before the ship began to sink, suggesting possible sabotage. Others described unusual behaviour by crew members or problems with the ship's equipment that might have indicated advanced planning of the disaster. These problematic testimonies were reportedly suppressed or discredited during the official investigations. Survivors who told inconvenient stories found their credibility questioned or their testimony excluded from the final reports. The investigation focused on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures rather than examining the possibility of deliberate destruction. The passenger list evidence is compelling but circumstantial. The coincidence of having so many Federal Reserve opponents aboard while Morgan and his allies stayed away is remarkable, but it could be explained by factors other than conspiracy. The timing of the banking legislation might have been influenced by the victims' deaths, but correlation does not necessarily prove causation. However, when combined with the physical evidence and the financial motives, the passenger list adds another layer to the case for the switch theory. The pattern of who was aboard and who wasn't suggests a level of planning and coordination that goes beyond simple insurance fraud. If the theory is correct, the Titanic disaster was not just about swapping damaged ships or collecting insurance money. It was about reshaping the American financial system and eliminating opposition to a plan that would concentrate enormous power in the hands of a few men. But such an ambitious conspiracy would require more than just manipulating passenger lists and switching ships. It would require control over the disaster itself, ensuring that the sinking occurred under circumstances that would support the official story while achieving the conspiracy's goals. As we'll see in the next chapter, proponents of the switch theory believe that every aspect of the sinking was carefully planned and executed. The final act of any great conspiracy must be the most carefully orchestrated. If the switch theory is correct, then the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912 represented not a tragic accident, but the culmination of months of planning designed to create the appearance of disaster while achieving very specific goals. Every detail of how the ship encountered the iceberg, how she sank, and how the rescue efforts unfolded would need to serve the larger purpose of the conspiracy. To understand how the sinking might have been deliberately orchestrated, we must first examine the unusual circumstances that made the disaster possible. The night of April 14th was characterised by conditions that maritime experts describe as extraordinarily rare and dangerous. The sea was unusually calm, so still that there were no waves breaking against icebergs to make them visible from a distance. The night was moonless, creating darkness so complete that lookouts had virtually no natural illumination to aid their watch. Most unusually, the atmosphere was clear and cold, creating temperature inversion conditions that could cause unusual optical effects, making distant objects appear closer or farther than they actually were. These conditions, while natural, were so unusual that many experienced sailors reported they had never encountered anything like them. Captain Smith himself, with 4 decades of experience on the North Atlantic, had never commanded a ship through such treacherous natural circumstances. But according to the switch theory, these conditions were not just unfortunate coincidences, they were anticipated and exploited by conspirators who had carefully planned the ship's route and timing to take advantage of known dangerous conditions. The theory suggests that the ship's course was deliberately set to take her through areas where icebergs were known to be present. Radio warnings about ice had been received throughout the day, but many of these warnings were reportedly not passed to the bridge crew, or were ignored by officers who should have taken precautionary measures. The ship Californian, which belonged to the same parent company as the Titanic, had stopped for the night in the ice field, her captain declaring conditions too dangerous for navigation. Yet the Titanic continued at nearly full speed through the same waters, despite multiple warnings about the presence of ice. Switch theory proponents argue that this dangerous navigation was not the result of overconfidence or poor judgment, but rather deliberate policy designed to ensure that an accident would occur. The ship needed to encounter an iceberg in order to provide a plausible explanation for her sinking, and her officers were instructed to maintain course and speed despite the obvious dangers. The collision itself occurred under circumstances that some witnesses found suspicious. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who first spotted the iceberg, reported that the berg appeared suddenly out of the darkness, giving him only seconds to sound the alarm. However, other witnesses reported seeing the iceberg minutes before the collision, suggesting that it should have been visible to trained lookouts much earlier. Some survivors reported that the ship seemed to turn toward the iceberg rather than away from it in the final moments before impact. While this could be explained by the physics of large ship manoeuvring, it raises questions about whether the collision was truly accidental or was deliberately engineered to ensure maximum damage. More suspicious were reports of explosions aboard the ship shortly after the collision. Multiple witnesses, including passengers and crew members, reported hearing loud bangs and feeling vibrations that seemed separate from the impact with the iceberg. These explosions were officially attributed to boilers bursting as cold water flooded the engine rooms, but some witnesses believed they occurred too soon after the collision to be explained by flooding alone. The switch theory suggests that these explosions may have been caused by deliberately placed charges designed to ensure that the ship would sink quickly and completely. If the collision with the iceberg was not sufficient to guarantee the ship's destruction, additional sabotage might have been necessary to achieve the conspiracy's goals. The pattern of flooding also struck some observers as unusual. While the official investigation concluded that the iceberg had opened 5 compartments to the sea, causing fatal flooding, some witnesses reported that water seemed to be entering the ship from multiple locations, not just the area of the supposed iceberg damage. Crew members working in areas far from the collision reported rapid flooding that seemed inconsistent with damage caused by scraping along an iceberg. Some suggested that the ship's hull might have been weakened in advance, either through the supposed identity switch or through deliberate sabotage, making her more vulnerable to catastrophic damage. The behaviour of some crew members during the disaster also raised questions. While many officers and crew performed heroically, trying to save as many passengers as possible, others seemed strangely unprepared for the emergency or reluctant to take action that might have saved more lives. The ship's wireless operators continued sending routine commercial messages even after the collision, delaying distress calls that might have brought rescue ships more quickly. Some officers seemed confused about the severity of the damage or uncertain about proper emergency procedures, suggesting that they might not have been fully briefed on the ship's actual condition or capabilities. Most suspiciously, the ship's lifeboats were launched with far fewer passengers than their capacity allowed. While this was officially attributed to panic and poor training, some witnesses reported that crew members actively prevented passengers from entering boats that had space available. The switch theory suggests that this was not incompetence but deliberate policy designed to ensure that specific passengers would not survive. If the conspiracy's goal was to eliminate certain individuals while allowing others to live, controlling access to lifeboats would be an effective method of determining who lived and who died. The nearby ship Californian adds another layer of suspicion to the night's events. This vessel, owned by the same International Mercantile Marine Company that controlled the White Star Line, had stopped for the night approximately 20 miles from the Titanic's position. Her captain, Stanley Lord, claimed that conditions were too dangerous for navigation and that his ship would remain stationary until dawn. However, the Californian's crew reported seeing rockets and distress signals from the direction of the Titanic throughout the night. Despite these obvious signs of a ship in distress, Captain Lord chose not to investigate or offer assistance. He claimed that he believed the signals were routine communications or celebrations, not emergency distress calls. This explanation seems implausible given that the Californian's crew were experienced sailors who should have recognised distress rockets when they saw them. The switch theory suggests that the Californian was positioned deliberately to provide rescue services for the conspiracy's chosen survivors while maintaining plausible deniability about why she didn't help the others. According to this theory, the Californian was meant to arrive at the scene early enough to rescue specific passengers, but late enough to allow the ship to sink and eliminate the unwanted victims. However, a miscommunication or timing error prevented this plan from working properly, leaving the Californian too far away to effectively participate in the rescue. Instead, the rescue was carried out by the Carpathia, a ship belonging to a different company that responded to the Titanic's distress calls and arrived at the scene several hours after the sinking. The Carpathia's captain and crew were not part of the conspiracy and perform genuine rescue work, saving over 700 survivors. But the delay in rescue efforts, whether planned or accidental, ensured that the ship sank completely and that most of her passengers and crew died in the frigid waters. This served the conspiracy's purposes by eliminating witnesses who might have been able to identify discrepancies between the Olympic and Titanic, while also removing the political opponents whose deaths were part of the larger plan. The sinking itself was remarkably complete and thorough. Unlike many shipwrecks, which settle on the ocean floor largely intact, the Titanic broke apart as she sank, scattering debris over a wide area and making subsequent examination of the wreck extremely difficult. This destruction could have been the result of natural forces acting on a ship not designed to sink at such an angle, but it also served to obscure evidence that might have revealed the ship's true identity. The complete loss of the ship meant that investigators had to rely on survivor testimony and limited physical evidence to reconstruct what had happened. Since many of the most knowledgeable witnesses had died in the disaster, and since the survivors had been through a traumatic experience that might have affected their memories, establishing definitive facts about the sinking proved difficult. This uncertainty served the conspiracy's purposes by preventing too close an examination of the evidence. Questions about the ship's identity, the cause of the sinking, or the behaviour of the crew could be deflected by pointing to the lack of conclusive evidence and the confusion inherent in any major disaster. The official investigations that followed the disaster focused primarily on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures. While these investigations identified important problems with lifeboat capacity, crew training and emergency procedures, they did not seriously examine the possibility that the sinking had been deliberately caused. The British Board of Trade Inquiry and the US Senate investigation both concluded that the disaster was the result of excessive speed in dangerous conditions, combined with design flaws that made the ship vulnerable to the type of damage caused by the iceberg collision. These findings supported the official narrative of an accidental tragedy, while deflecting attention from possible evidence of conspiracy. However, some evidence presented to these investigations was inconsistent with the official conclusions. Witnesses testified about explosions, unusual flooding patterns, and crew behaviour that suggested advanced knowledge of the disaster. This testimony was generally dismissed or explained away, but it remained part of the official record for those who knew where to look for it. The investigations also revealed suspicious gaps in the documentary evidence. Ship logs, construction records, and other documents that might have provided definitive information about the vessel's identity or condition were missing or had been destroyed. While this was officially attributed to the chaos of the disaster, it prevented investigators from definitively establishing key facts about the ship and her voyage. Perhaps most tellingly, the investigations made no serious attempt to examine the financial aspects of the disaster. The insurance arrangements, the ownership structure of the shipping companies, and the business relationships between key figures were not considered relevant to understanding why the ship sank. This focus on technical rather than financial questions served the conspiracy's purposes by avoiding examination of the motives that might have driven such an elaborate deception. The investigations treated the disaster as a tragic accident rather than a possible crime, and their conclusions reinforced the official narrative that has persisted for over a century. But if the switch theory is correct, the sinking of the Titanic was not just a crime, but a nearly perfect crime. The destruction of evidence, the elimination of witnesses, and the misdirection of official investigations created a cover-up so complete that the truth has remained hidden for more than 100 years. As we'll see in the next chapter, maintaining this cover-up required ongoing efforts by powerful interests to suppress evidence, discredit investigators, and control the historical narrative of the disaster. In the aftermath of any major conspiracy, the cover-up often proves more challenging than the original crime. Evidence must be suppressed, witnesses must be silenced or discredited, and investigators must be misdirected away from uncomfortable truths. If the switch theory is correct, the years following the Titanic disaster saw one of the most comprehensive and successful cover-ups in modern history. The cover-up began almost immediately after news of the disaster reached shore. Within hours of the Carpathia's arrival in New York with the Titanic survivors, powerful interests were already working to control the narrative of what had happened and to prevent inconvenient questions from being asked. J.P. Morgan's representatives were among the first to arrive at the dock, not to provide comfort to survivors, but to begin the process of managing information. Survivors were reportedly approached by company officials and lawyers who offered assistance with travel arrangements, medical care and financial support. However, this assistance came with subtle but clear expectations about what survivors should and should not say about their experiences. Some survivors later reported being advised to focus their testimony on the heroism of the crew and the tragedy of insufficient lifeboats, while avoiding speculation about the cause of the disaster or unusual circumstances they might have observed. Those who had noticed discrepancies between the ship they boarded and the ship they expected to board were encouraged to attribute these differences to their own confusion or lack of technical knowledge. More direct pressure was reportedly applied to survivors whose testimony might have been particularly damaging to the official narrative. Crew members who had worked on both the Olympic and Titanic and might have been able to identify which ship actually sank were offered generous severance packages and assistance finding new employment, with the understanding that their maritime careers would be over if they spoke publicly about their experiences. The most dangerous witnesses were those who had observed the supposed identity switch taking place in the Belfast shipyard. These workers faced more serious consequences if they chose to speak out. Some reported being visited by company representatives who made it clear that their employment, their safety and the welfare of their families depended on their discretion. James Fenton, the painter who had noticed unusual modifications being made to the Olympic, later claimed that he was approached by men who warned him that discussing his observations would be considered a breach of his employment contract and potentially a criminal violation of trade secrets laws. He was told that speaking to journalists or investigators could result in prosecution and imprisonment. Other shipyard workers reported similar intimidation. Some were offered money to relocate to distant cities where they would be less likely to encounter investigators or journalists. Others were simply fired from their jobs and found that their names had been blacklisted throughout the shipbuilding industry, making it impossible for them to find similar work. The most comprehensive aspect of the cover-up involved the systematic destruction or alteration of documentary evidence. Harland and Wolff shipyard records that might have revealed the true extent of work done on both ships were reportedly destroyed in a series of accidental fires and floods that occurred in the months following the disaster. Work orders, progress reports, and material requisitions that could have definitively established which ship was which were among the documents lost in these convenient accidents. The missing records covered precisely the time period when the alleged identity switch would have taken place, eliminating the most direct evidence of the conspiracy. More subtly, surviving documents were reportedly altered to remove inconvenient details or to create confusion about the timeline of work done on both ships. Serial numbers were changed, dates were altered, and work descriptions were modified to obscure the true nature of the modifications that had been made. The British Board of Trade investigation, which was the primary official inquiry into the disaster, showed unusual patterns in how it gathered and evaluated evidence. The investigation focused almost exclusively on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures, while avoiding examination of financial motives or business relationships that might have suggested conspiracy. Key witnesses who might have provided inconvenient testimony were not called to testify, or their testimony was limited to narrow technical questions that avoided broader issues about the ship's identity or the circumstances of the voyage. The investigation's final report contained numerous conclusions that were not fully supported by the evidence presented, suggesting that the outcomes had been predetermined. Even more suspicious was the speed with which the investigation was concluded and its findings accepted by government authorities. For a disaster of such magnitude and complexity, the investigation was remarkably brief and superficial. Important questions were left unanswered, and significant discrepancies in witness testimony were ignored or explained away without adequate investigation. The US Senate investigation, led by Senator William Alden Smith, initially appeared more thorough and independent. Senator Smith was known for his skepticism of large corporations and his willingness to challenge powerful interests. His investigation called numerous witnesses and examined many aspects of the disaster that the British inquiry had ignored. However, as the investigation proceeded, it became apparent that Senator Smith was facing pressure from influential sources to limit the scope of his inquiry. Key witnesses were suddenly unavailable or changed their testimony between preliminary interviews and formal hearings. Documentary evidence that had been promised to the investigation failed to materialise or was found to be incomplete. Most tellingly, the investigation avoided examining the financial aspects of the disaster. Despite the enormous insurance claims involved and the clear financial benefits that accrued to certain parties, the investigation treated these as irrelevant side issues rather than potential motives for conspiracy. The final report of the Senate investigation contained strong criticisms of White Star Line's safety procedures and British maritime regulations, but it concluded that the disaster was fundamentally accidental. Like the British inquiry, it avoided any suggestion that the sinking might have been deliberately caused, or that there might have been financial motives behind the tragedy. In the years following the official investigations, efforts to independently examine the disaster faced systematic obstruction. Journalists who attempted to investigate discrepancies in the official story found their sources drying up and their access to information restricted. Maritime historians who raised questions about the disaster's circumstances found their work discredited or their employment threatened. Perhaps most remarkably, several independent investigators who had begun to uncover evidence supporting the switch theory died under suspicious circumstances. Some died in apparent accidents, others from sudden illnesses, and still others simply disappeared while pursuing their research. Robert Hitchens, the shipyard worker who had observed unusual activity around the ship's nameplates, died in a fall from scaffolding while working on another project less than a year after the disaster. The accident occurred despite Hitchens' reputation as an experienced and safety-conscious worker who had never before been injured on the job. John Halpern, the ship fitter who had worked on swapping components between the Olympic and Titanic, died of a sudden heart attack despite being relatively young and having no history of heart problems. His death occurred just days before he was scheduled to be interviewed by an American journalist who was investigating discrepancies in the official story. Several other shipyard workers who had knowledge of the construction process died in various accidents or from sudden illnesses in the years immediately following the disaster. While these deaths could be coincidental, the pattern suggests a systematic effort to eliminate witnesses who might have provided inconvenient testimony. The cover-up also extended to controlling the physical evidence from the disaster. When bodies were recovered from the ocean, they were processed through facilities controlled by White Star Line representatives. Personal effects were catalogued and returned to families, but items that might have provided clues about the ship's true identity were reportedly lost or misdirected. More significantly, efforts were made to prevent independent examination of the wreck site. In the early decades after the disaster, technology did not exist to reach the wreck on the ocean floor, but White Star Line and its successors took steps to ensure that when such technology became available, access to the wreck would be controlled. Legal claims were filed asserting ownership rights over the wreck and its contents. These claims were designed to prevent independent researchers from examining the evidence without permission from the companies that had controlled the ships. By controlling access to the wreck, these interests could ensure that any examination would be conducted under their supervision and that inconvenient findings could be suppressed. The most sophisticated aspect of the cover-up involved shaping the cultural memory of the disaster. Rather than simply suppressing evidence, the conspiracy's beneficiaries actively promoted a specific narrative about the Titanic that emphasized heroism, tragedy, and the lessons learned about maritime safety. Books, articles, and eventually films about the disaster focused on human interest stories, rather than technical questions about the ship's identity or the circumstances of the sinking. The narrative of the brave band playing hymns as the ship sank, of the noble sacrifice of men who gave their lives so that women and children could survive, and of the hubris of calling any ship unsinkable, became the dominant cultural memory of the disaster. A massive thank you to Dogface680 and so many others who suggested this incredible topic. Your video ideas keep this channel going. If you have suggestions for future videos, please drop them in the comments below. Now, let's dive into one of the most chilling government experiments you've never heard of. Some secrets don't get buried, they get frozen. In March 2004, something happened inside a sealed laboratory at Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico. The official record says nothing. The budget documentation lists a single line item: Applied Chronophysics Integration. The project lead, a brilliant Air Force physicist named David Lewis Anderson, walked into a temporal containment field for a routine 10-minute test. That was 21 years ago. For Anderson, those 10 minutes still haven't ended. This is the story of how the United States military accidentally trapped a man in time and why they might never be able to bring him back. March 1999, Rome, New York. The Air Force Research Laboratory at Griffiths Air Force Base didn't look like the kind of place where reality could be rewritten. Low brick buildings, chain-link fences, security badges that beeped at turnstiles. It was the kind of facility that processed grants for satellite communication upgrades and radar improvements, the unglamorous backbone of military research. David Lewis Anderson worked in Building 7, 3rd floor, in an office that smelled like burnt coffee and ozone. At 32, he was one of the youngest civilian physicists on the USAF Time-Related Research Program, a division so obscure that most airmen on the base didn't know it existed. Anderson's specialty was electromagnetic field manipulation, specifically how rotating magnetic fields affected subatomic particles in ways that classical physics couldn't quite explain. He'd noticed something strange during a routine particle confinement experiment. Decay rates inside his toroidal field chamber were slightly slower than they should have been. Not by much, a fraction of a microsecond. But it was measurable, repeatable, and according to Einstein's theory of relativity, it meant one thing: time inside the field was moving slower than time outside it. Anderson had stumbled onto this discovery almost by accident. He'd been running experiments on particle containment for the better part of 2 years, trying to develop more efficient methods for stabilizing unstable isotopes. The military applications were obvious. If you could slow radioactive decay, you could store nuclear materials more safely, transport them more easily, extend their operational lifespan. But what Anderson found was far more profound. He'd been using cesium-137, a radioactive isotope with a half-life of about 30 years, as his test subject. Standard procedure was to measure the decay rate both inside and outside the containment field to ensure the field wasn't interfering with the isotope's stability. Except the decay rate inside the field was consistently slower. At first, Anderson thought it was measurement error. He recalibrated his instruments. He ran the test again and again. The results were identical every time. The cesium inside the field was decaying more slowly than it should. Not dramatically, we're talking fractions of microseconds, but consistently, measurably slower. Anderson knew what this meant. Radioactive decay is one of the most consistent processes in nature, a fundamental clock that ticks at the same rate regardless of temperature, pressure, or chemical environment. The only thing that can change decay rates is time itself. He spent 3 weeks reviewing the data, checking for every possible alternative explanation. He consulted with colleagues, carefully avoiding any mention of his hypothesis. He reviewed every paper ever published on time dilation, from Einstein's original work to the most recent experiments with atomic clocks. Finally, he was certain. He'd created a temporal distortion field. On March 17th, 1999, Anderson filed an internal white paper with the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. The title was dry, academic, deliberately understated: Preliminary Model for Controlled Temporal Fields in Particle Confinement. Inside, the implications were staggering. Anderson theorized that by rotating electromagnetic fields at precise frequencies, it might be possible to create a localized distortion in space-time, a bubble where time moved at a different rate than the surrounding environment. Not time travel exactly, time dilation. A pocket of slow time. The mechanism, he explained, was related to frame-dragging effects predicted by general relativity. When massive objects rotate, they drag space-time along with them. Earth does this. It's called the lens-throwing effect. But the distortion is minuscule, barely measurable even with the most sensitive instruments. But what if you could amplify that effect? What if, instead of rotating mass, you rotated electromagnetic fields at enormous intensities? The math suggested it was possible. The experimental data suggested he'd already done it. The paper was 17 pages long. It included equations, experimental data, and a cautious conclusion. Further research recommended to determine scalability and practical applications. Anderson submitted the paper on a Wednesday afternoon. By Friday morning, his lab was swarming with visitors. They didn't identify themselves by name, just by agency. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, National Security Agency, a civilian liaison from the Department of Energy. They asked questions. They reviewed his data. They examined his equipment with the kind of intensity that made Anderson deeply uncomfortable. 3 months later, Anderson's lab was shut down. The official explanation was budget reallocation. His funding, roughly $2 million annually, was transferred to a classified DARPA project called the Quantum Waveform Defense Initiative. Anderson was told his research would continue under the new program, just in a different capacity. He was also told not to publish his findings. The meeting where they delivered the news took place in a windowless conference room on base. There were 4 people present. Anderson, his supervisor, and 2 men in dark suits who never gave their names. One of them slid a document across the table, a non-disclosure agreement. 23 pages of legal language that boiled down to this. Everything Anderson had discovered about time dilation was now classified. Talking about it publicly would be a federal crime. Publishing it would be treason. Anderson had spent his entire career in pursuit of scientific knowledge. The idea that his greatest discovery would be locked away, hidden from the world, was devastating. But he signed the agreement. What choice did he have? In July 1999, Anderson left the Air Force. He moved to Long Island and founded the Anderson Institute, a private research organisation dedicated to what he called time control research for humanitarian use. The website featured photos of sleek laboratories and optimistic descriptions of future applications: medical stasis, space travel, advanced computing. What the website didn't mention was that Anderson's Air Force security clearance remained active for another 6 years, or that he'd signed a non-disclosure agreement with the Department of Defense that classified his research under the same legal framework used for nuclear weapons development, or that his departure from the Air Force wasn't really a departure at all. 2001 to 2003, Long Island, New York. The Anderson Institute operated out of a converted industrial building in Hopogue, a suburb 40 miles east of Manhattan. From the outside, it looked like any other tech startup. Glass doors, modernist furniture, a receptionist who smiled and asked visitors to sign in. Inside, Anderson was building something extraordinary. He called it the T3 time field generator. The device was deceptively simple in concept. A toroidal magnetic coil, about the size of a washing machine, capable of generating rotating electromagnetic fields at frequencies precise to the nanosecond. Suspended in the centre of the coil was a vacuum chamber where test subjects, particles, molecules, eventually small objects, could be placed. The goal was to create a measurable time differential. If successful, the clock inside the field would tick slower than a clock outside it. Anderson's funding came from a mix of private investors and anonymous grants. He suspected, correctly, that at least some of the money was coming from government sources, filtered through shell companies and defence contractors. But he didn't ask questions, the work was too important. The first prototype was completed in March 2001. It was crude, cobbled together from salvaged equipment and commercial components. The magnetic coils were wrapped by hand. The control systems were jury-rigged from laboratory surplus, but it worked. The first test was conducted on March 23, 2001, at 3:47 a.m. Anderson had been working for 36 hours straight, fueled by coffee and the kind of manic energy that comes from being on the verge of a breakthrough. He placed a quartz clock inside the vacuum chamber. Simple, mechanical, the kind of clock you could buy at any department store. Outside the chamber, he placed an identical clock, synchronized to the nanosecond using a GPS time signal. Then he activated the field. For the first 30 seconds, nothing happened. The coils hummed. The chamber vibrated slightly. Anderson watched the clocks, waiting. Then he noticed it. The clock inside the chamber was running slow, just barely but visibly. A second would pass on the external clock, and the internal clock would advance only by 0.999997 seconds. 3 microseconds of dilation per second. Doesn't sound like much. 3 millionths of a second. But in the world of experimental physics, it was groundbreaking. Proof that time could be manipulated, controlled, slowed. Anderson ran the test again, and again. The results were consistent. Over the next 2 years, he refined the design. Larger coils, more powerful magnets, better control systems. By late 2002, he'd achieved dilation rates of up to 10 microseconds per second. The T3 could slow time by 1%. He published a brief paper in an obscure physics journal. The reaction from the scientific community was muted, skeptical. Time dilation had been observed before, in particle accelerators, in atomic clocks on airplanes, but always as a byproduct of extreme speed or gravity. Anderson was claiming he could do it with stationary electromagnetic fields. Most physicists dismissed it as experimental error. A few expressed polite interest. None of them took it seriously, but not everyone was skeptical. In 2002, DARPA released a roadmap document titled Quantum Information Science and Technology, Strategic Vision and Research Plan. Buried on page 87, under a section labelled Areas of Strategic Interest, was a single line. Localized temporal phase anomalies. No explanation, no context, just those 4 words. Anderson saw the document and knew immediately what it meant. The military was interested in his work. They were pursuing it, probably through multiple channels, funding research at universities and national labs under innocuous-sounding program names. He wasn't the only one working on time control. He was just the only one doing it publicly. In September 2002, Anderson was invited to present his work at a small physics symposium in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The venue was a hotel conference room, the kind of place usually reserved for corporate training seminars. The audience was fewer than 30 people, mostly academics and a handful of government observers who sat in the back row and didn't ask questions. Anderson's presentation was cautious, technical. He showed data. He explained the theory. He suggested potential applications, space travel where astronauts could age more slowly, computational systems that could process information faster than normal time, medical stasis for patients awaiting treatment. He didn't mention the military applications, but everyone in the room was thinking about them. One man in the audience took detailed notes. Careful, methodical notes filling page after page of a leather-bound notebook. Lieutenant Colonel James A. Ransone, a liaison for the U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory Directed Energy Division. Ransone had a background in advanced weapons systems, lasers, microwave emitters, particle beams. He understood the potential of Anderson's work better than most of the civilians in the room. A time dilation field wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was a weapon, a tool, a way to tilt the battlefield in ways that no enemy could counter. After the presentation, Ransone introduced himself. He was polite, professional, careful not to seem too eager. He congratulated Anderson on his work. He asked a few technical questions, the kind that demonstrated genuine understanding. 3 weeks later, Anderson received a phone call. Ransone was calling from Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. He got straight to the point. The Air Force was interested in exploring potential defence applications of Anderson's research. They wanted to fund a full-scale demonstration. State-of-the-art equipment, unlimited budget, access to the best physicists in the country. Anderson hesitated. He'd left the Air Force to pursue independent research, to avoid the secrecy and restrictions of military projects. But Ransone made an offer he couldn't refuse. Not just funding, recognition. If the experiment succeeded, Anderson's name would be attached to one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs in history. The man who proved that time could be controlled. There was also an implicit threat, though Ransone never stated it directly. Anderson's research was already classified. The non-disclosure agreement he'd signed in 1999 was still active. If he refused to cooperate, the government could shut down his institute, seize his equipment, and bury his work under classification orders. He could cooperate, or he could be silenced. In December 2002, Anderson signed a contract with the Department of Defense. He told himself he was doing it for science, for the chance to pursue his research at a scale that would have been impossible otherwise. But deep down, he knew the truth. He'd never really left the Air Force. He'd just been working off-site. 2004, Sandia National Laboratories, New Mexico. Sandia. National Laboratories sits on the edge of Albuquerque, a sprawling complex of buildings and bunkers tucked into the desert foothills. It's one of 3 labs in the United States responsible for maintaining the nuclear stockpile, a place where the cutting edge of physics meets the blunt reality of weapons development. Anderson arrived in January 2004. The project had a name now, Kronos. The acronym stood for something bureaucratic and forgettable: Kinetic Resonance Observation and Neutralization Operation System. But everyone involved knew what it really meant. Kronos, the Greek god of time, the titan who devoured his children. The symbolism wasn't lost on Anderson. Time devours everything eventually. But what if you could slow it down? What if you could make a single moment last forever? The goal was simple: build a scalable temporal containment field, something larger than Anderson's original prototype, something that could hold not just particles but objects, eventually maybe even people. The official justification was national security. Temporal stasis field could revolutionize warfare, freeze enemy munitions in mid-flight, store unstable isotopes indefinitely, create unbreakable communication delays that would make code breaking impossible. But Anderson knew the real reason the military was interested. If you could slow time, you could speed up everything else. A soldier in a time-dilated field could train for months while only hours passed in the outside world. A weapons lab could run decades of research in a fraction of the time. An intelligence agency could interrogate prisoners for years without anyone noticing they'd been gone. The ethical implications were staggering. Anderson tried not to think about them. The lab was located in Building 6580, a reinforced concrete structure with no windows and 3 layers of security clearance. The building was technically part of Sandia's Z-Machine complex, the facility that housed the most powerful X-ray generator on Earth. But Building 6580 existed in a kind of bureaucratic limbo, not listed on official maps, accessed through a separate gate that required special authorization. The equipment was the best Anderson had ever worked with. Superconducting magnets capable of generating fields measured in tens of Tesla. Precision atomic clocks accurate to 1 second in 300 million years. Quantum sensors capable of detecting fluctuations in space-time down to the Planck scale. The smallest measurable unit of distance in the universe. The team was small: Anderson, 2 Air Force physicists named Chen, and Rodriguez, a handful of engineers, and Lieutenant Colonel Ransone, who observed every test with the quiet intensity of a man who knew this project could change the world. There were also observers, men and women who never gave their names, who sat in a separate control room behind reinforced glass and watched everything through cameras. Anderson assumed they were intelligence analysts, or maybe military strategists trying to figure out how to weaponize his discovery. He tried not to think about them either. The new design was based on Anderson's T3 prototype, but scaled up dramatically. The magnetic coils were arranged in a nested toroidal configuration, creating a containment field that was both more stable and more powerful. The control systems used quantum computers to adjust the field parameters in real time, compensating for fluctuations and maintaining coherence. The containment chamber itself was a cylinder, about 8 feet in diameter and 10 feet tall, large enough to hold equipment, instruments, eventually a person. The first test was scheduled for early March. They started small. a simple atomic clock placed inside the chamber and monitored for temporal anomalies. The field was activated for 5 minutes, running at low power. The clock fell behind by half a second. The second test ran for 10 minutes at higher power. The clock fell behind by 3 seconds. The third test ran for 15 minutes at maximum power. The clock fell behind by 22 seconds. The field was working. Not just working, exceeding expectations. The dilation rates were far higher than anything Anderson had achieved in his Long Island lab. But there was a problem. The field was stable, too stable. Once activated, it showed no signs of decay or degradation. The magnetic coils spun at precise frequencies. The energy levels remained constant. The space-time distortion held steady. In theory, that was good. A stable field meant predictable, controllable time dilation. But it also meant the field didn't want to shut down. The engineers had to manually collapse the magnetic fields, forcing the system offline. And each time they did, the instruments detected strange fluctuations, brief spikes in radiation, gravitational anomalies, distortions in the local electromagnetic field. Anderson compared it to popping a soap bubble. The bubble is stable as long as the surface tension holds, but when it breaks, the energy has to go somewhere. Rodriguez, one of the Air Force physicists, ran simulations. The results were troubling. If a large-scale temporal field collapsed suddenly, especially one containing a significant mass, the energy release could be catastrophic. Not nuclear bomb catastrophic, but enough to cause serious damage. And if something living were inside the field at the moment of collapse... Rodriguez didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The team decided to proceed with extreme caution. The next test would be longer, more ambitious. They would activate the field for 30 minutes and monitor it continuously, gathering data on stability, coherence, and energy consumption. The test was designated Cycle 11C. It was scheduled for March 12, 2004. March 12th, 2004, 2:06 p.m. Mountain Time. Anderson stood in the control room watching the technicians make final preparations. The containment chamber sat in the centre of the lab, surrounded by diagnostic equipment and safety barriers. The magnetic coils were already humming, running through their pre-activation sequence. Inside the chamber, they'd placed an array of instruments: atomic clocks, radiation detectors, temperature sensors, cameras, everything they'd need to monitor conditions inside the field. Ransone stood beside Anderson, arms crossed, watching the same scene through the reinforced glass. "This is it," Ransone said quietly. "If this test succeeds, we move to Phase 2. "Which is?" Anderson asked, though he already knew the answer. "Human testing." Anderson felt a knot form in his stomach. He'd always known it would come to this. You couldn't revolutionize warfare, or medicine, or space travel, or any of the other applications, without eventually putting a person inside the field. But the idea still made him uneasy. "We'll need to run more tests first," Anderson said. "Animals, at least. Mice, then something larger. We need to understand the biological effects." "We understand enough," Ransone interrupted. "The field doesn't affect matter directly. It affects time, and biology operates on the same time as everything else. If the field is safe for a clock, it's safe for a person," Anderson wanted to argue. But the logic was sound, even if the conclusion made him uncomfortable. At 2 p.m, the final checks were complete. Rodriguez gave the signal. The technicians cleared the lab, retreating behind safety barriers. At 2:06 p.m. and 27 seconds, Anderson pressed the activation button. The magnetic coils spun up to full power. The air inside the chamber shimmered, distorting like heat waves rising off the asphalt. The instruments registered the familiar signatures of temporal distortion, gravitational anomalies, electromagnetic fluctuations, a subtle warping of space itself. The atomic clocks inside the chamber began to fall behind. For the first 5 minutes, everything proceeded normally. The field held steady. The instruments transmitted data continuously. The dilation rate stabilized at approximately 4.2%, meaning time inside the field was passing about 4.2% slower than outside. At 2:15 p.m, something changed. The dilation rate increased. Not by much, just a few tenths of a percent, but it was unexpected. The field was supposed to be stable. Anderson checked the control systems. Everything was normal. The magnetic coils were operating within parameters. The energy levels were steady, but the dilation rate kept climbing. 4.5%, 4.8%, 5.1%. What's happening? Ransone asked. I don't know, Anderson admitted. The field's stabilising at a higher dilation rate than we calculated. Is that a problem? Anderson didn't answer immediately. He was running calculations in his head, comparing the observed data to the theoretical predictions. It shouldn't be, he said finally. The field's still coherent. It's just stronger than expected. By 2:30 p.m, the dilation rate had stabilised at 6.7%. The atomic clocks inside the chamber were now falling behind by about 4 seconds every minute, which meant that for every hour that passed outside the chamber, only about 56 minutes passed inside. The test was supposed to run for 30 minutes of external time. Inside the chamber, that would be about 28 minutes. But Anderson made a decision. He decided to enter the chamber himself. It wasn't planned. Ransone objected immediately. The engineers protested, but Anderson was adamant. We need to know what it's like inside, he said. I'll go in for 10 minutes. That's less than 9.5 minutes for me. I'll observe, take notes, and come right back out. This is insane, Rodriguez said. We haven't tested this on anything living. I'll be fine, Anderson insisted. The field doesn't cause physical harm. It just slows time. I won't even feel it. Ransone considered for a long moment. Then he nodded. 10 minutes, he said. External time. We shut down the field at 2:47 p.m. exactly, whether you're ready or not. Anderson agreed. He entered the containment chamber at 2:37 p.m. From Anderson's perspective, entering the chamber was unremarkable. The air felt normal, the temperature was comfortable, the lighting was slightly dim, but that was just the design of the chamber. He could hear the hum of the magnetic coils, a deep thrumming sound that resonated in his chest, but it wasn't unpleasant. He checked his watch. 2:37 p.m. The plan was simple. Stay inside for 10 minutes, observe conditions, document everything, then exit and report his findings. Anderson walked around the interior of the chamber examining the instruments. The atomic clocks were running normally. From his perspective, he knew they were falling behind the external clocks, but he couldn't perceive the difference. Time felt normal. He spoke into a digital voice recorder documenting his observations. 2:38 p.m, internal conditions nominal. No discomfort, no unusual sensations. Temperature approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Lighting adequate. Acoustic environment normal apart from the magnetic coil hum. He checked the instruments. Radiation levels normal. Electromagnetic field strength within expected parameters. 2:40 p.m. All systems appear stable. No adverse effects observed. Subjective experience of time appears normal, which is consistent with relativity theory. From my reference frame, time is passing at the normal rate. The dilation is only apparent from an external frame. He continued his observations, checking instruments, taking measurements, speaking into the recorder. 2:43 p.m. Midpoint of observation period. Continuing to feel normal. No dizziness, nausea, or disorientation. Cognitive function appears unaffected. He glanced at his watch again. 2:44 p.m. 6 minutes had passed for him. Outside, it would be close to 6.5 minutes, maybe 7 given the increased dilation rate. He had about 4 more minutes to go. Anderson decided to conduct a simple cognitive test. He recited the first 50 digits of pi from memory, then performed several mental arithmetic calculations. Everything seemed normal. His mind was sharp, his thoughts clear. 2:46 p.m. cognitive function test complete. No deficits detected, preparing to exit. He stopped mid-sentence. Something was wrong. Not with him, with the field. He could feel it now. A subtle change in the air pressure, a slight increase in the magnetic field intensity. The hum of the coils was getting louder, deeper. Anderson looked at the instruments. The electromagnetic field strength was increasing, not dramatically, but measurably. Outside, he knew the technicians would be seeing the same data. They'd be debating whether to shut down the field early. He checked his watch. 2:47 p.m, time to exit. He walked to the chamber door and reached for the handle. It didn't move. Anderson tried again, pulling harder. The door was sealed tight. He spoke into the recorder, trying to keep his voice calm. 2:47 p.m. Door appears to be sealed. Possibly a safety interlock. We'll wait for technicians to open from outside. He waited. 1 minute passed, then 2. His watch read 2:49 p.m. For him, 12 minutes had elapsed since he'd entered the chamber. But outside, if his calculations were correct, it would be close to 2:50 p.m, 13 minutes of external time. They should have opened the door by now. Anderson felt the first flicker of concern. Outside the chamber, panic was setting in. At 2:47 p.m, as planned, the technicians began the shutdown sequence. They reduced power to the magnetic coils, initiating the controlled collapse of the temporal field. But the field didn't collapse. The dilation rate decreased slightly, dropping from 6.7% to about 6.5%. But the field remained stable, coherent, active. "It's not shutting down," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with stress. Ransone leaned over the control console. "Why not?" "I don't know. The magnetic field should be decaying, but they're holding steady. It's like the field has achieved some kind of equilibrium state. It's self-sustaining." Anderson, inside the chamber, was still visible on the video monitors. He was standing by the door, clearly trying to exit. Ransone made a decision. Open the door manually, emergency override. The technicians tried. The door was magnetically sealed, designed to maintain the integrity of the containment environment. The override should have released it, but it didn't work. "The magnetic field is interfering with the locking mechanism," one engineer reported. "We can't open it while the field is active." "Then collapse the field," Ransone ordered. "We're trying, sir." It's not responding. Inside the chamber, Anderson had figured out what was happening. The field had stabilized at a higher energy state than expected, and now it was trapped in that state. Shutting it down would require more than just reducing power to the coils. It would require a complete reconfiguration of the system, possibly even a forced magnetic collapse. But that would be dangerous. A sudden collapse could create a temporal shear, a violent reintegration of the time differential. Inside the chamber, where time was passing 6.5% slower, Anderson would experience the collapse as a sudden acceleration. His body would be forced to catch up with external time in an instant. The energy release would be catastrophic. Rodriguez was running the same calculations. His face had gone pale. "If we force the collapse," he said quietly, "the temporal shear could kill him." Ransone stared at the monitor, watching Anderson pace inside the chamber. "What are our options?" "We keep the field running," Rodriguez said. "Maintain it indefinitely until we can figure out a way to safely bring it down." "How long?" "I don't know. Days, weeks, maybe longer." Inside the chamber, Anderson checked his watch. 2:53 p.m. For him, 16 minutes had passed. Outside, it was approximately 2:54 p.m., 17 minutes. He'd expected to be out by now. The test should have been over, but the door was still sealed and he could hear the coils still humming. Something had gone wrong. Over the next several hours, external time, the team at Sandia tried everything. They attempted to gradually reduce the field strength, hoping to slowly bring the dilation rate down to 0. But every time they adjusted the power, the field compensated, maintaining its equilibrium. They tried to override the door locks mechanically, using hydraulic tools to force it open, but the magnetic field was too strong, interfering with the mechanisms. They even considered cutting through the chamber walls with plasma torches, but the chamber was designed to contain radiation and electromagnetic fields. The walls were reinforced with layers of new metal and lead. Cutting through them would take days, and all the while Anderson was inside, unaware of the crisis unfolding around him. From his perspective, only about 90 minutes had passed. He'd tried the door periodically, spoken into his recorder, documented his situation. He was concerned but not panicked. He assumed the delay was technical, that the team was working on the problem. He had no idea they couldn't get him out. By 8 p.m. external time, about 7:30 p.m. for Anderson, the situation was clear. The field wasn't going to collapse naturally. It would continue running indefinitely, or until the power supply failed, and forcing it to collapse would kill Anderson. Ransoni convened an emergency meeting with the project leads. Anderson was still visible on the monitors, sitting inside the chamber, reading a technical manual he'd found on a shelf. "We have 3 options," Rodriguez said. 1. We keep the field running indefinitely and hope we eventually figure out how to safely collapse it. 2. We cut power to the facility, which will force an immediate collapse and almost certainly kill Anderson. 3. We seal the chamber permanently and leave him in there. The room was silent. "Option 3 isn't an option," Ranson said firmly. "We're not abandoning him." "Then we go with option 1, Rodriguez replied. "We maintain the field, we keep monitoring, and we research. Maybe we'll find a solution." It was decided. The field would continue running. The chamber would be sealed, not permanently but securely to prevent accidental interference. The entire module would be classified at the highest level, and research would continue in secret. They would find a way to save Anderson. They had to. But weeks passed, then months, and the field remained stable, unyielding. Inside the chamber, Anderson's watch showed that only about 6 hours had passed. He was confused, frustrated, but still hopeful. He assumed the delay was temporary, that the team was working on a solution. He had no way of knowing that outside the world was moving on without him. August 2005. The Anderson Institute's website went dark on August 14th, 2005. There was no announcement, no explanation. One day the site was live. Photos of laboratories, press releases, contact information. The next day, it was gone. Replaced by a blank page with a single line of text. Experiments currently suspended for government collaboration. Anderson's colleagues were given minimal information. They were told he'd taken a long-term consulting position with the government, working on classified projects at an undisclosed location. They were asked politely but firmly not to discuss the nature of his work. Most accepted the explanation. A few were suspicious. One engineer, Thomas Keller, couldn't let it go. He'd worked with Anderson for 3 years, building the T3 prototype, refining the designs. They'd been friends. And now Anderson had vanished without a word, without even a goodbye. Keller sent emails, they bounced back. He tried calling, the numbers were disconnected. Finally, in September 2005, Keller drove to Sandia National Laboratories. He showed up at the main gate, asked to speak with Anderson, said it was urgent. Security escorted him off the property. 2 weeks later, Keller received a visit from 2 men in dark suits. They identified themselves as Department of Defense investigators. They asked him about his relationship with Anderson. They asked if he'd shared any information about the time dilation experiments. They reminded him that violating a federal non-disclosure agreement carried a prison sentence of up to 10 years. Keller never spoke about Anderson again. Meanwhile, at Sandia, the sealed chamber sat in building 6580, humming quietly, ignored by everyone except a handful of technicians who monitored it remotely. Inside, Anderson had no idea that 18 months of external time had passed. For him, it was still March 12th, 2004. Only about 11 hours had elapsed since he'd entered the chamber. He'd stopped speaking into the recorder. He'd stopped trying the door. He'd settled into a kind of routine, sleeping, reading the technical manuals stored in the chamber, doing exercises to stay physically fit. He'd long since figured out that something had gone seriously wrong. But he also knew that panicking wouldn't help. The team outside would fix the problem. They had to. He just had to wait. 2010. The hacker collective called themselves Black Obelisk. They specialised in infiltrating government contractor networks, exploiting the weak security that often existed in the civilian companies that serviced classified projects. In March 2010, they hit Los Alamos National Laboratory, or rather, they hit a contractor that managed the lab's email servers. The cache they released was enormous, thousands of documents, most of them mundane, budget reports, personnel evaluations, equipment manifests. But buried in the archive was a PDF titled Temporal Field Integrity Log, Test Cycle 11C. The document detailed the March 2004 test at Sandia. It listed Anderson as the test subject, and it included a chilling line in the final entry. Subject remains in containment, field stable, extraction impossible without catastrophic temporal shear, recommend indefinite maintenance protocol. The internet exploded with speculation, forums filled with theories, but within 48 hours every copy of the document vanished. Websites were scrubbed, servers were seized. Black Obelisk went silent. The story faded into conspiracy theory territory, dismissed as an elaborate hoax. But a few copies survived, hidden in encrypted drives and dark web archives, and some people believed. 2022, Brooklyn, New York. Elena Warren was researching Cold War DARPA projects for a podcast when she stumbled across a reference to the Quantum Waveform Defense Initiative in a declassified memo. She filed FOIA requests. She tracked down Anderson's old patents. She found the Black Obelisk leak archived on an obscure server. Most importantly, she found a pattern. Equipment transfers from Sandia to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 2006. A sealed module labelled Kronos, do not open. She traced the module's current location. It was still there, in a sub-basement facility at Wright-Patterson, consuming electricity 24 hours a day. Still running. March 2023. Elena found Gary Holcomb, a retired Air Force technician who'd maintained the electrical systems at Sandia during the Kronos project. He was dying of cancer and he decided to talk. The field never shut down, Holcomb told her over coffee at a small Arizona diner. They couldn't collapse it without killing him, so they just kept it running, built a containment structure around it, moved the whole thing to Wright-Patterson. Is he still alive? Elena asked. Depends on how you define alive, Holcomb said. For us it's been 20 years. For him it's been maybe a day and a half at most. Can they ever bring him out? Holcomb shook his head slowly. The math doesn't work. The temporal differential is too large now. If they collapse the field, his body will try to sync with external time instantly. The energy release would be... He trailed off. They ran simulations. Every scenario ends the same way. Elena recorded everything. 2 hours of testimony. She titled the file chronology_Anderson final.wave. 2 weeks later, Holcomb died. Natural causes, the death certificate said. But when Elena checked her recording, something impossible had happened. The file's metadata showed a creation date of March 12th, 2004, 14:06:27. The same moment Anderson had entered the chamber. No outlet would publish her story. Legal departments cited national security concerns. Editors called it too risky. The investigation died, but Eleanor kept the files. October 2024. Late one night, the Anderson Institute's website came back online. The page was simple, black background, white text. Temporal field integrity, 100%. Containment status, holdings, March 12th, 2004, 14:06:27. Active. The timestamp didn't move. It stayed frozen at that exact moment. Someone examined the page's source code and found a hidden comment. For David Lewis Anderson, only 27 hours had passed since he entered the chamber. He was still inside, still alive, still waiting for someone to open the door and tell him the test was over. Outside, 21 years had gone by. The website stayed live for 3 days, then vanished. But screenshots circulated. The timestamp became an internet legend. Proof that somewhere in a sealed basement at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a man was trapped in a moment that would never end. The field continued to hum. The magnetic coils continued to spin, and time inside that chamber moved infinitely slower than the world outside. Time dilation is real. Einstein proved it. Astronauts age slower in space. Atomic clocks tick differently at different altitudes. But localized time dilation created by electromagnetic fields. The physics is theoretical. Possible perhaps, but unproven. Unless it has been proven, and the results are locked away behind classification orders that will never expire. If the military did succeed in creating a temporal containment field, if they did trap a man inside it, We would never know. The technology would be buried under the same legal protections as nuclear weapons. The researchers would be silenced, the evidence would disappear. And if someone were trapped inside, caught in a bubble of slow time that could never be safely collapsed, there would be no rescue, no happy ending. Just a man, waiting in a moment that never ends while the world outside moves on without him. Somewhere in the classified depths of a military facility, a timestamp blinks on a monitor. March 12th, 2004, 14:06:27, active. For David Lewis Anderson, the test is still running. It might run forever.